Hi everyone. Tonight we begin with something far from romantic castles or noble quests. This is the slow, grinding discomfort of life inside a medieval city. These crowded urban centers might have been hubs of trade, politics, and culture, but for the people living there, it was less about grand history and more about daily survival. Picture streets packed shoulder to shoulder with people, the air thick with smoke, sewage, and the smell of livestock. Imagine trying to sleep with the noise of shouting vendors, clanging bells, and the occasional warning cry before waste comes flying from an upstairs window. The food is often stale, the water rarely clean, and illness lurks around every corner. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the mix of night owls and sleepyheads from all corners of the world. So dim the lights, maybe crack open a window for that soft nighttime breeze, and settle in as we gently drift back. Let your mind wander through the narrow streets, past the leaning timber houses, and into the heart of a medieval city. Let's ease into tonight's journey, starting right at street level. Step outside your small timber-framed house at dawn, and the first thing that greets you isn't the cool morning air. It's the smell. The scent of a medieval city is something layered and unrelenting. There's the sharp sting of wood smoke from hundreds of hearths burning through the night. There's the tang of unwashed bodies after days, or sometimes weeks without a proper bath. But underneath it all, there's a low, sour note that never truly leaves. It's the smell of waste, both human and animal, seeping from gutters, soaking into the dirt, and lingering in every corner where the city's drains fail to carry it away. The waste problem goes deeper than what meets the nose. Medieval cities had no sewage systems as we understand them today. Instead, they relied on a patchwork of ditches, channels, and open streams that wound their way through the urban landscape. These waterways, meant to carry away refuse, often became clogged with debris, rotting food, and worse. During heavy rains, they would overflow, sending their putrid contents flooding into cellars, workshops, and living spaces. The wealthy might have private latrines that emptied into cesspits beneath their homes. But even these required regular cleaning by the gong farmers, men who would arrive in the dead of night to shovel out the accumulated filth and cart it away to the fields outside the city walls. The cobblestones beneath your feet tell their own story of urban decay. Where stones are missing, deep ruts have formed in the packed earth, creating pools of stagnant water that never quite dry. These muddy patches become breeding grounds for insects and disease. The stones that remain are slick with a film of grease, food scraps, and animal droppings that have been ground into the surface by countless feet and wheels. In winter, this mixture freezes into treacherous patches of ice. In summer, it bakes under the sun, releasing waves of putrid vapor that make breathing an exercise in endurance. The streets are narrow, so narrow that two carts cannot pass side by side without one backing up. Houses lean toward each other from both sides of the road. Their top floors jut out until you can almost reach across and shake hands with your neighbor in the house opposite yours. The city was never designed for comfort or space. It grew out of necessity. Houses and shops were crammed together as people poured in, seeking work, trade, or safety behind the city walls. This means light struggles to reach street level. The lower lanes stay dim and damp even at midday. This architectural cramping creates a unique ecosystem of shadows and secrets. The overhanging upper floors, called jetties, were built to maximize living space on expensive urban land, but they also create tunnels of perpetual twilight at street level. Moss grows on the north-facing walls where sunlight never penetrates. The timber frames of houses begin to rot from the constant moisture, and you can see the evidence in the way buildings sag and lean, as if the city itself is slowly melting under the weight of its own density. Between these leaning structures, alleyways branch off like capillaries, some so narrow that a person with outstretched arms can touch both walls simultaneously. These passages serve as shortcuts for those who know them, but they also become dumping grounds for refuse too bulky for the main streets. Dead cats, broken pottery, and spoiled merchandise accumulate in these forgotten corners, creating miniature mountains of decay that the city's sanitation efforts, such as they are, never quite reach. The verticality of medieval urban life means that every story of a building serves a different function. Ground floors, house shops, and workshops, their wide doors thrown open to display wares and accommodate the flow of customers. The constant hammering of blacksmiths, the scraping of carpenters' planes, and the rhythmic pounding of textile workers creates a symphony of industry that echoes between the close-set buildings. Above the shops, on the second and third floors, families make their homes in spaces that might consist of just 1 or 2 rooms for an entire household. Privacy is a luxury that simply doesn't exist. Conversations carry through thin walls, and the sounds of daily life, from cooking to arguing to lovemaking, become communal experiences whether the participants wish it or not. The highest floors often serve as storage for goods or as housing for apprentices and servants. These spaces, tucked under the peaked roofs, are stifling in summer and freezing in winter. The only light comes from small windows fitted with expensive glass for the wealthy, or simply covered with oiled cloth or shutters for everyone else. During cold months, people huddle around small braziers filled with glowing coals, risking suffocation from the fumes in exchange for a few degrees of warmth. Walk a little further, and you'll hear the marketplace long before you see it. Vendors shout over each other, calling out the day's wares. Chickens cluck from wicker cages. The iron bell of a fishmonger clangs to announce yesterday's catch. It is still wet, but already starting to turn beneath the morning sun. A barrel tips over in the street, spilling its contents of spoiled fruit or maybe discarded entrails from a nearby butcher's stall. Flies gather almost instantly. The marketplace serves as the beating heart of medieval urban life, but it's a heart that pumps with chaotic, often dangerous rhythm. Merchants arrive before sunrise to claim the best spots, setting up their stalls by torchlight. The earliest vendors are usually the bakers, whose ovens have been burning since midnight to produce the day's bread. The scent of fresh loaves provides a brief respite from the city's other odors, but even this pleasure is tinged with anxiety. Bread prices fluctuate wildly based on grain harvests, political conflicts, and the whims of local guild regulations. A loaf that costs 2 pence today might cost 5 tomorrow, and for families living on the edge of subsistence, these fluctuations can mean the difference between eating and starving. As the morning progresses, other vendors join the chorus. Fishmongers display their catch on beds of rapidly melting ice, if they're lucky enough to have ice at all. More often, fish are simply laid out on wooden boards, their glassy eyes staring at potential customers, while their scales catch what little sunlight filters down to street level. The smell of fish, fresh or otherwise, mingles with the aroma of roasting meat from cookshops, where entire pigs and sides of beef rope in fires. Fat drips and sizzles in the flames, sending up plumes of aromatic smoke that can momentarily mask the less pleasant odors of the city. Vegetable sellers spread their wares on coarse cloth laid directly on the cobblestones. Turnips, onions, and cabbages that may have traveled for days in ox-drawn carts bear the marks of their journey. Bruised apples are sold at discount, while the finest specimens are reserved for wealthy customers who can afford to be choosy. Herb sellers offer bundles of mint, parsley, and rosemary, but they also deal in more questionable remedies. Dried powders in small pouches promise to cure everything from headaches to impotence, though their actual ingredients remain mysterious, even to those who sell them. The livestock section of the market presents its own challenges. Pigs root through whatever scraps they can find, their squeals adding to the general cacophony. Chickens, crammed into wicker baskets, create a constant rustling and clucking that serves as background music to negotiations over their eventual fate. Goats bleat from wooden pens, while sheep huddle together in confused masses, their wool matted with mud and worse. The smell of animal waste is overwhelming here, but customers have learned to breathe through their mouths and conduct their business quickly. Between the legitimate merchants, other figures work the crowds. Pickpockets move with practiced stealth, targeting distracted shoppers fumbling with their purses. Beggars position themselves near the church entrance, where charitable impulses might be strongest, displaying their injuries and deformities with theatrical flair. Street performers compete for attention and coins. They're juggling balls and musical instruments, providing entertainment that ranges from genuinely skillful to desperately amateur. The marketplace also serves as the city's primary source of news and gossip. Traveling merchants bring word from other towns and kingdoms. Local residents share information about births, deaths, marriages, and scandals. Political developments are discussed in hushed tones, as even in the seemingly anonymous crowd of the market, one never knows who might be listening on behalf of local authorities. If you linger too long near a crowd, you might feel something wet splatter your shoulder. That's because chamber pots don't empty themselves. With no indoor plumbing, the upper stories of houses often rely on gravity, and little more than a shouted warning before waste gets dumped out of a window into the street below. Some neighborhoods develop a system with a quick call of Gardy-Loo before the contents follow, but many simply don't. The waste disposal situation creates a complex social hierarchy of its own. The wealthy, whose houses often feature private courtyards or gardens, might have their servants empty chamber pots into designated areas away from public thoroughfares. The middle classes, living in the cramped quarters above their shops, must rely on the window method, timing their disposals to avoid peak foot traffic when possible. The poorest residents, crowded into subdivided rooms in the oldest and most decrepit buildings, often share communal latrines that overflow regularly, creating health hazards that affect entire neighborhoods. The timing of waste disposal follows its own unwritten etiquette. Early morning and late evening are considered the most acceptable times, when fewer people are moving through the streets. But necessity doesn't always align with social niceties, and the sudden splash of liquid waste punctuates the urban soundscape throughout the day. Those walking the streets develop an unconscious awareness of the upper story windows, listening for the telltale creaking of shutters being opened, or the scraping of pottery against wooden sills that might signal an impending deluge. The waste that accumulates in the streets creates a secondary economy. Street sweepers, usually among the poorest residents, earn meager wages collecting refuse for disposal outside the city walls. Rakers, as they're sometimes called, work with crude tools to scrape up the accumulated filth, loading it into handcarts or wheelbarrows for transport to designated dumping grounds. Some of this waste finds its way to nearby farms, where it serves as fertilizer, but much of it simply accumulates in growing mounds beyond the city's defensive walls, creating permanent monuments to urban decay that can be smelled for miles downwind. The lack of proper sanitation affects every aspect of daily life. Clothing worn in the streets must be cleaned frequently, but soap is expensive and washing is labor-intensive. Many people simply accept that their garments will carry the permanent odors of city life. Shoes, for those fortunate enough to own them, wear out quickly from the corrosive effects of the street conditions. Leather, in particular, suffers from constant exposure to acidic waste, requiring frequent replacement that strains household budgets. Fire is a constant fear. Roofs are thatched, walls are timber, and candles burn in nearly every room. One stray ember, one neglected stove, and entire rows of houses can vanish overnight. Cities do have night watchmen to sound the alarm, but by the time the bell rings, it's often too late for the affected streets. The omnipresent threat of fire shapes every aspect of medieval urban architecture and daily life. Building codes, where they exist at all, are rudimentary and rarely enforced. Timber construction dominates because wood is relatively cheap and quick to work with, but it also creates perfect conditions for catastrophic blazes. The practice of storing hay, straw, and other flammable materials in upper floors turns every building into a potential tinderbox. When fire does break out, it spreads with terrifying speed along the closely packed structures, jumping from roof to roof faster than people can escape. Fire prevention measures are primitive but essential. Many cities mandate that buckets of water or sand be kept readily available in public spaces, though these prove woefully inadequate when faced with a serious blaze. Some wealthy districts organize volunteer fire brigades, but their equipment consists of little more than hooks for pulling down burning thatch, and leather buckets for forming water chains from the nearest well or river. The hooks, called fire hooks, can sometimes prevent a fire from spreading by creating fire breaks. But this often means deliberately destroying buildings that aren't yet burning, a decision that must be made in seconds as flames approach. The night watch system provides the city's first line of defense against fire, but watchmen are often elderly, disabled, or otherwise unable to find more lucrative employment. They patrol with lanterns, creating the ironic situation of using open flames to guard against fire hazards. When a blaze is spotted, watchmen are supposed to ring alarm bells positioned throughout the city. But the bells themselves are often difficult to hear over the ambient noise of urban life, and their meanings can be confused with signals for other emergencies. Individual buildings attempt their own fire protection through various means. Stone chimneys, where they exist, represent significant investments, but offer crucial safety improvements over simple holes in the roof for smoke to escape. However, many households still rely on central hearths with no chimneys at all, simply allowing smoke to find its way out through gaps in the roof structure. Cooking fires are particularly dangerous, as they must be maintained throughout the day for meal preparation and often burn unattended while household members attend to other duties. The aftermath of major fires creates opportunities for urban renewal, but also tremendous hardship. Entire neighborhoods can be reduced to ash and rubble in a single night, leaving hundreds of families homeless. Rebuilding efforts are hampered by the same economic pressures that created the original fire hazards, leading to the reconstruction of equally dangerous structures. Insurance doesn't exist in any meaningful form, so fire victims must rely on charity, family assistance, or simply start over with nothing. And then there's illness. Even without the looming threat of a major plague, sickness is part of daily life. Coughs echo through the streets. Children develop fevers that come and go, often without explanation. Skin rashes appear and spread with no clear cure. Rats scurry between market stalls, weaving between feet, largely unnoticed and ignored. The medical landscape of a medieval city is a complex mixture of folk wisdom, religious faith, and dangerous ignorance. Professional physicians exist, but they're expensive, and their treatments often cause more harm than good. Their understanding of anatomy and disease is based on ancient texts rather than direct observation, leading to treatments that seem bizarre and frequently fatal by modern standards. Bloodletting is considered a cure-all for conditions ranging from headaches to broken bones, while mercury and other toxic substances are prescribed for ailments that would resolve naturally with rest and proper nutrition. More commonly, residents turn to local wise women, herbalists, and barber surgeons for medical care. These practitioners work with a combination of genuine knowledge about medicinal plants and pure superstition. Some herbs do provide real relief for common ailments, but the dosages are guesswork, and contamination with other plants or substances creates additional risks. Barber surgeons, who combine hair cutting with basic medical procedures, perform tooth extractions, wound treatment, and minor surgeries with no understanding of infection control or sterilization. The prevalence of disease in medieval cities stems largely from the living conditions themselves. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making residents susceptible to infections that well-fed populations might fight off easily. The contaminated water supply spreads dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases, while the poor air quality from smoke and waste contributes to respiratory problems. Skin conditions flourish in environments where bathing is infrequent and clothing is shared among family members. Childhood mortality rates reflect the harsh realities of urban medical care. Families routinely lose several children to diseases that are preventable or easily treatable with modern medicine. Measles, whooping cough, and other childhood diseases sweep through neighborhoods with deadly efficiency, while infections from minor cuts and scrapes claim lives when wounds become gangrenous. Parents develop a fatalistic attitude toward their children's health, viewing survival to adulthood as a blessing rather than an expectation. Mental illness presents particular challenges in medieval urban environments. The stress of city life, combined with poor nutrition and constant exposure to trauma, creates high rates of what we would now recognize as anxiety and depression. However, these conditions are typically interpreted through religious or supernatural frameworks. People suffering from mental health crises might be seen as possessed by demons, blessed with divine visions, or simply weak in character. Treatment options range from prayer and pilgrimage to physical restraint and exile from the community. The rat population that scurries through the streets represents both a visible symptom of urban decay and a major disease vector, though the connection between rodents and illness isn't understood. Rats thrive in the waste-filled environment of medieval cities, finding ample food sources in discarded scraps and garbage. They nest in the walls of buildings, in piles of stored goods, and in the spaces beneath floors. Their presence is so common that people barely notice them, except when populations grow so large that they begin competing directly with humans for food resources. Yet despite it all, life in the city hums along. People gather at public wells to share gossip and draw their water. Bakers roll out new loaves before sunrise. Artisans hammer away in open workshops. Street performers sing or juggle for a few spare coins. Life is hard, unpredictable, and dirty, but to those who live here, it's just life. The resilience of medieval urban populations reflects humanity's remarkable ability to adapt to difficult circumstances. Social structures develop organically to address the challenges of city life. Neighborhood watch groups form to provide security in areas where official law enforcement is minimal or corrupt. Religious communities offer support networks for those facing hardship, while guild organizations provide both economic opportunities and social safety nets for their members. Public wells serve as more than just sources of water. They become focal points for community interaction. Women gathering water in the early morning hours exchange information about family news, business opportunities, and potential threats. The quality of well water varies dramatically depending on location and maintenance, but these gathering points remain essential to the social fabric of urban life. Some wells are controlled by wealthy families or religious institutions, creating complex hierarchies around access to this most basic necessity. The rhythm of daily work provides structure and meaning despite the harsh conditions. Artisans take genuine pride in their craftsmanship, creating goods that must meet the exacting standards of guild regulations and customer expectations. The blacksmith forging horseshoes and the carpenter building furniture work with skills passed down through generations, finding satisfaction in their ability to create useful and beautiful objects despite the limitations of their tools and materials. Street performers and entertainers provide crucial psychological relief from the stresses of urban life. Musicians with simple instruments create impromptu concerts in market squares, while storytellers weave tales of adventure and romance that transport listeners far from their immediate surroundings. Jugglers and acrobats demonstrate skills that seem miraculous to audiences whose own lives are constrained by physical hardship and limited mobility. The seasonal rhythms that govern rural life persist even in urban environments. Summer brings longer working hours and increased commercial activity, but also higher risks of disease, as waste and standing water create ideal breeding conditions for insects and bacteria. Winter reduces some health hazards, but introduces others, as people crowd together in poorly ventilated spaces for warmth, facilitating the spread of respiratory infections. Religious observances provide regular breaks from the grinding routine of daily survival. Saints' days and other holy occasions offer opportunities for community celebration, while also serving economic functions, as times when normal work restrictions are relaxed and special markets are permitted. These celebrations often involve elaborate processions through the streets, transforming the same narrow passages that normally channel waste and traffic into stages for pageantry and spiritual expression. For the visitor, though, for someone like you dropped into this world for even a single day, it would be overwhelming. The noise, the smells, the lack of privacy, and the ever-present risk of sickness or injury. Sleep would come slowly, if at all, as your mind tried to process the sensory overload of it all. The psychological impact of medieval urban life on a modern visitor would extend far beyond simple discomfort. The constant proximity to death and disease, the absence of concepts like personal space and privacy, and the overwhelming assault on all the senses would create a state of perpetual stress that most contemporary people have never experienced. The sounds alone would be unbearable. The creaking and groaning of wooden buildings settling on their foundations, the constant chatter of voices speaking in dialects, barely recognizable as early forms of familiar languages, the cries of animals being slaughtered for food, and the periodic tolling of church bells marking prayers, announcements, and alarms. The visual environment would prove equally challenging. Accustomed to electric lighting and clean, geometric urban design, a modern visitor would struggle to navigate spaces where shadows dominate and architectural lines follow no systematic plan. The people themselves would appear alien, their faces marked by poor nutrition, missing teeth, and the scars of diseases long since eradicated. Their clothing, patched and repatched, would bear the permanent stains of lives lived without adequate washing facilities or cleaning supplies. The social interactions would perhaps be the most difficult aspect to navigate. Medieval urban society operates according to complex hierarchies and unwritten rules that govern everything from where one can walk to whom one can address directly. A modern visitor's assumptions about equality and individual rights would be not just irrelevant but potentially dangerous, as violations of social protocol could result in public humiliation, economic sanctions, or even physical punishment. The absence of modern medical knowledge would create constant anxiety for someone aware of the invisible dangers surrounding them. Every drink of water, every bite of food, every breath of air would carry risks that the local population accepts as unavoidable facts of life. The knowledge that minor injuries could easily become fatal infections, that foodborne illnesses could kill in days, and that epidemic diseases could sweep through the population without warning would make even routine activities feel perilous. And with that slow, heavy picture in your mind, let's ease forward now, from the grinding discomfort of daily life to a moment when the city changed forever, as fears swept through the streets and neighbors began to disappear overnight. But even as we contemplate the overwhelming challenges of ordinary medieval urban existence, we must remember that these cities had survived and even thrived for generations before that fateful moment, when something far worse than their everyday hardships arrived at their gates. The same cramped conditions that made life difficult, the same poor sanitation that created constant health risks, the same trade networks that brought prosperity, and variety to urban markets would soon become the perfect infrastructure for humanity's greatest catastrophe. The rats that scurried unnoticed through the streets carried more than just the usual urban diseases. The ships that brought exotic goods to the bustling harbors carried passengers that no customs official could detect. The roads that connected these vibrant, chaotic cities to the wider world had become highways for an enemy that recognized no borders, respected no social hierarchies, and showed mercy to neither rich nor poor. What was about to unfold would make the daily struggles of medieval city life seem like a golden age of peace and prosperity. The smell of waste in the gutters would be replaced by the stench of mass graves. The familiar sounds of commerce and craftsmanship would give way to the prayers of the dying and the silence of abandoned neighborhoods. The crowded streets that seemed so overwhelming would soon echo with emptiness as entire. Districts fell victim to forces beyond human understanding or control. The governance of these medieval cities operates through a web of competing authorities that would baffle any modern administrator. The Lord of the Manor holds ultimate power, but his influence competes with that of the church, the merchant guilds, and sometimes a nascent city council elected from among the wealthier residents. Each authority claims jurisdiction over different aspects of urban life, leading to conflicts that can paralyze decision-making when crises arise. A dispute over grain prices might involve the Lord's bailiff, the Bakers' Guild, the church's representative concerned with feeding the poor, and city councilmen worried about civil unrest. The legal system reflects this fractured authority structure. Different courts handle different types of cases, and the same crime might be tried under manor law, church law, or guild regulations, depending on who commits it and where. A theft in the marketplace might be judged by guild officials if it involves their members, by church authorities if it occurs on consecrated ground, or by the Lord's court if it affects his direct interests. The punishments vary wildly between these different legal systems, creating a patchwork of justice that depends more on political connections than consistent application of law. Currency presents its own complications in medieval urban commerce. Multiple types of coins circulate simultaneously, issued by different authorities and containing varying amounts of precious metal. A merchant might receive payment in silver deniers from France, copper pennies from local mints, and gold byzants from Byzantine trade, all within a single transaction. Money changers operate near the main markets, but their exchange rates fluctuate based on political relationships, seasonal trade patterns, and the suspected purity of different coin issues. The weight and metal content of coins degrades through use and deliberate clipping, making every transaction a negotiation over the actual value being exchanged. Credit systems develop organically to address the complications of currency exchange and the risks of transporting large amounts of precious metal. Italian banking families pioneer techniques for transferring funds across long distances without moving actual coins. But these services remain expensive and available only to wealthy merchants. Local credit relationships are more common, with neighborhood shopkeepers extending trust to regular customers and settling accounts periodically. These informal credit networks create complex webs of obligation that can strengthen community bonds, but also lead to bitter disputes when economic conditions change. The working day begins before dawn for most urban residents, driven by the need to maximize productivity during daylight hours. Candles and oil lamps provide some illumination after dark, but they're expensive enough that most work ceases at sunset, except for essential activities. The rhythm of work follows seasonal patterns, with longer hours during summer months and reduced activity during the darkest winter periods. This creates feast or famine cycles of productivity that affect everything from food prices to tax collection. Guild systems dominate skilled trades, creating elaborate hierarchies that control everything from training procedures to pricing structures. Apprentices, typically boys from rural families seeking urban opportunities, bind themselves to master craftsmen for periods of 7 years or more. During this time, they receive minimal wages while learning trade secrets that are carefully guarded within each guild. The apprenticeship system serves multiple functions. It provides cheap labor for established craftsmen, ensures quality control over products, and maintains artificial scarcity in skilled trades by limiting the number of new practitioners. Journeymen occupy the middle tier of guild hierarchies, having completed their apprenticeships but not yet achieved master status. They travel between cities, working for different masters while accumulating the skills and capital needed to establish their own workshops. This mobility creates informal networks for sharing information about market conditions, technical innovations, and political developments across different urban centers. Journeymen often lodge together in guild-sponsored hostels, creating communities of young men whose loyalty transcends local political boundaries. Achieving master status requires demonstrating technical competence through the creation of a masterpiece, a finished product that meets guild standards for quality and complexity. However, the masterpiece requirement serves as much to limit competition as to ensure quality. Established masters have economic incentives to reject borderline cases, maintaining high barriers to entry that protect their market positions. The costs associated with setting up an independent workshop further restrict access to master status, creating a system where hereditary advantages often matter more than pure skill. Women's roles in medieval urban economies vary significantly based on social class and local customs. Wealthy merchants' wives often manage significant portions of family businesses, particularly when their husbands travel for trade. They maintain account books, negotiate with suppliers, and supervise employees with authority that would surprise those familiar only with later historical periods when women's economic roles became more restricted. However, their power derives from their husband's status and can disappear instantly upon widowhood if male relatives choose to assert control over business assets. Working-class women contribute to family income through various forms of labor that operate alongside or outside guild structures. They brew ale for neighborhood consumption, take in laundry and mending, prepare food for sale in markets, and provide childcare for neighbors. These activities often blur the lines between household duties and commercial enterprises, creating informal economies that supplement the more visible male-dominated trade systems. Women also dominate certain crafts, particularly textile production, where their work ranges from spinning thread in their homes to managing large commercial operations producing cloth for export. The presence of religious institutions throughout medieval cities creates parallel power structures that compete with secular authorities. Churches and monasteries own significant amounts of urban property, collecting rents and tithes that flow outside normal tax systems. Religious communities also provide services that secular authorities cannot or will not offer, including education, healthcare, and charity for the destitute. However, these services come with expectations of religious conformity and moral behavior that can conflict with the practical needs of commercial life. Monasteries within city walls often maintain extensive gardens and workshops that produce goods for both internal consumption and commercial sale. Monks skilled in brewing, manuscript copying, and metallurgy compete directly with secular craftsmen while enjoying tax exemptions and other privileges that create market advantages. This competition generates ongoing tensions between religious and secular communities, particularly during economic downturns when every commercial opportunity becomes fiercely contested. The educational landscape of medieval cities reflects the competing influences of church and commerce. Cathedral schools provide basic literacy and numeracy training for boys destined for religious careers, while some wealthy merchants hire private tutors for their sons. However, formal education remains rare and expensive, creating a population where the vast majority of residents cannot read or write. This illiteracy has profound implications for urban governance, commercial practices, and social mobility, concentrating power in the hands of the small, educated elite. Oral culture dominates information sharing among the general population. News travels through networks of gossip and storytelling, creating opportunities for information to be distorted as it passes from person to person. Public announcements are made by town criers, who read official proclamations aloud in market squares. But the accuracy of these announcements depends on the crier's own literacy and their political relationships with various authorities. Rumors about everything from military campaigns to grain harvests can trigger market panics or civil unrest, making information control a crucial aspect of urban governance. The transportation systems that connect medieval cities to their surrounding regions operate on principles that seem impossibly slow and unreliable by modern standards. Ox-drawn carts lumber along unpaved roads that become impassable mud channels during wet seasons and choking dust clouds during dry periods. River transport offers faster alternatives where geography permits, but seasonal flooding and drought create unpredictable delays. The cost of moving heavy goods like grain or building materials represents a significant portion of their final price, making local production attractive even when distant suppliers might offer higher quality or lower base costs. Urban workshops adapt to these transportation limitations by developing regional specializations based on locally available raw materials. Cities near iron deposits focus on metalworking, while those with access to good clay develop pottery industries. These specializations create trade relationships between different urban centers, but they also make cities vulnerable to disruptions in their supply chains. A failed harvest in the grain-producing regions can create famine in manufacturing cities, while political conflicts can cut off access to essential raw materials for months or years. The seasonal nature of medieval agriculture creates dramatic fluctuations in urban food supplies that affect every aspect of city life. Late summer brings abundance as new harvests arrive, driving down grain prices and allowing even poor families to eat adequately. However, the period just before harvest, sometimes called the hunger gap, sees food prices spike as stored supplies dwindle. These price fluctuations can be extreme enough to trigger social unrest, as urban workers watch their real wages collapse, while wealthy merchants and landlords profit from scarcity. Food preservation techniques determine what types of nutrition are available throughout the year. Salting, smoking, and drying allow some foods to be stored for months. But these preservation methods alter nutritional content and flavor in ways that make stored food less appealing and less nourishing than fresh alternatives. The wealthy can afford spices that mask the taste of preserved foods and provide some nutritional benefits. But most urban residents must accept monotonous diets based on bread, porridge, and whatever preserved proteins they can obtain. Urban crime operates according to patterns shaped by the physical and social environment of medieval cities. The narrow, poorly lit streets provide ideal conditions for robberies and assaults, while the maze-like layout makes escape relatively easy for those familiar with local geography. However, the close-knit nature of neighborhood communities also means that criminals often operate near their own homes, making them vulnerable to identification and retaliation. Professional criminal organizations are rare. Most crime involves desperate individuals taking advantage of immediate opportunities. The night hours bring particular dangers as legitimate residents retreat indoors, leaving the streets to those with questionable intentions. Night watchmen patrol main thoroughfares, but the side alleys and residential areas remain largely unprotected. Taverns stay open after dark, creating focal points for both entertainment and trouble as alcohol consumption leads to fights and other disturbances. Prostitutes, officially condemned by church authorities, but tolerated by secular officials who tax their activities, operate from specific districts that become centers of nighttime activity. Urban fire hazards extend beyond the obvious risks of thatched roofs and wooden construction to include the industrial activities that define city life. Blacksmiths' forges, potters' kilns, and bakers' ovens all present fire risks that are concentrated in commercial districts. These workshops often operate in the ground floors of residential buildings, meaning that an industrial accident can quickly spread to living spaces above. The practice of storing flammable materials like straw, oil, and cloth in the same buildings where fires are used for production creates perfect conditions for catastrophic blazes. Chimney construction represents one of the few significant technological improvements in fire safety during this period. But the transition from central hearths to walled fireplaces happens slowly and unevenly. Wealthy households invest in stone chimneys that reduce indoor smoke and fire risks. But poor families continue to rely on simple holes in the roof for smoke evacuation. The contrast between neighborhoods with modern fireplace technology and those still using primitive heating methods creates visible divisions in urban landscapes that reflect broader patterns of economic inequality. Water management systems in medieval cities operate through combinations of public wells, private cisterns, and diverted streams that create complex networks of access and control. The quality of water varies dramatically depending on its source and the path it takes through the urban environment. Wells located upstream from major population centers provide relatively clean water, while those downstream from latrines and workshops carry contamination that residents learn to identify by taste and smell, but cannot effectively eliminate. Public fountains and wells serve as gathering points for community interaction, but they also become sources of conflict when water supplies diminish during dry seasons. Wealthy households sometimes monopolize the best water sources through private ownership or political influence, forcing poorer residents to rely on more contaminated alternatives. The daily task of hauling water from public sources to individual homes provides employment for those too young, old, or disabled for other forms of work, creating an informal economy around this basic necessity. The boundary between urban and rural life remains fluid throughout the medieval period, with many city residents maintaining agricultural connections that supplement their urban incomes. Small gardens tucked between buildings provide vegetables and herbs for household consumption, while some residents keep chickens or pigs in courtyards or shared spaces. During harvest seasons, urban workers often travel to nearby farms to earn extra income, creating temporary labor migrations that blur the distinctions between city and countryside. Markets for livestock within city limits create unique challenges for urban management. Cattle, pigs, and sheep driven through narrow streets for slaughter at urban butcher shops contribute to the general chaos of city traffic, while creating sanitation problems that exceed even the normal standards of medieval urban waste management. The blood and offal from slaughtering operations must be disposed of quickly to prevent disease. But the systems for waste removal are already overwhelmed by normal residential and commercial refuse. As we reflect on the full complexity of medieval urban life, from its carefully woven governance structures to its seasonal routines, from the quiet corners of religious observance to the shadowy paths of the city's criminal underworld, we start to see how these cities, for all their energy and resilience, stood on fragile ground. The same trade routes that filled the markets with goods and spices would soon carry something far more devastating. The same crowded streets that brought neighbors together would help something else spread with alarming speed. And the social systems that managed disputes, commerce, and daily survival would find themselves helpless in the face of something silent, invisible, and entirely indifferent to human plans. So with that lingering thought, let's gently step forward now. Let's move away from the rhythms of ordinary city life and into a time when fear settled over the streets like a heavy fog. Our next chapter, The Black Death, How One Pandemic Reshaped Medieval Europe. As you continue walking through the streets of the medieval city, imagine the familiar rhythm of daily life starting to unravel. It begins with quiet whispers. A merchant's assistant fails to show up for work. A neighbor's door stays closed for 2 days straight. Then, before long, word spreads that entire households have fallen ill. The year is 1348, and in cities across Europe, including London, Paris, Florence, and countless smaller towns, something terrible is taking hold. People call it the pestilence. Others simply call it the Great Mortality. Today, we know it as the Black Death. Picture yourself standing in the cobblestone streets of a thriving medieval city, just weeks before the plague arrives. The morning air fills with the sound of church bells calling people to prayer, the clatter of wooden cartwheels against stone, and the voices of merchants hawking their wares. Blacksmiths hammer iron into horseshoes and tools. Bakers pull fresh loaves from their ovens, filling entire neighborhoods with the warm smell of bread. Children run between the legs of adults, playing games with sticks and stones. Women gather at wells to draw water and exchange news. The city pulses with life, commerce, and community. The plague itself had been traveling for years before reaching Europe, following the ancient trade routes that connected the known world. It began its journey in the steppes of Central Asia, where it lived quietly among rodent populations. As trade networks expanded and merchants ventured further to secure precious goods like silk, spices, and precious metals, they unknowingly became carriers of something far more valuable and dangerous than any cargo they could imagine. Ships arriving at European ports carried more than exotic goods from distant lands. Hidden in their holds, among sacks of grain and bales of cloth, were the black rats that had become unwitting passengers. These rats carried fleas, and these fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the microscopic agent that would soon transform the face of medieval Europe forever. At first, the symptoms seemed like little more than a sudden fever and headache. But within hours, or at most a day or two, blackened swellings appear along the neck, in the armpits, and near the groin. They grow tender and painful. People complain of burning skin and overwhelming thirst. Soon after, many slip into a restless sleep from which they never wake. The progression of the disease was swift and merciless. Those who contracted the bubonic form of the plague might live for several days, giving families false hope that their loved ones might recover. The buboes, those characteristic swellings that gave the disease one of its names, would grow larger and more painful. Some would burst, releasing foul-smelling pus, while others remained hard and black beneath the skin. Victims experienced excruciating pain, high fevers that left them delirious, and often a desperate, unquenchable thirst that no amount of water could satisfy. But the plague took other forms as well. The pneumonic variant attacked the lungs directly, causing victims to cough up blood and struggle for breath. This form was even more deadly, killing most within 2 or 3 days. Worse still, it could spread directly from person to person through droplets in the air, making it impossible to avoid through isolation. The septicemic form poisoned the blood itself, causing dark patches to appear across the skin as tiny blood vessels burst beneath the surface. This gave some victims the blackened appearance that contributed to the plague's most famous name. The streets changed quickly. Where once vendors shouted and children played, now there is silence. Shop doors remain bolted shut. Churches begin to toll their bells more frequently, each one marking another life lost. The city, already thick with the smells of daily life, now holds the unmistakable weight of illness and decay. As the weeks pass, the transformation of the urban landscape becomes even more dramatic. The marketplaces that once buzzed with activity from dawn until dusk now stand eerily quiet. Stalls that displayed colorful fabrics, fresh produce, and handcrafted goods are abandoned, their wooden frames weathering in the elements. The guild halls, where craftsmen once gathered to discuss their trades and settle disputes, close their doors as their membership dwindles. Even the taverns, traditionally the heart of social life in medieval communities, grow dark and silent as their patrons either fall ill or flee the city entirely. The sound of the city changes too. Gone are the rhythmic hammering of the blacksmiths, the scraping of saws from the carpenters' workshops, and the lowing of cattle being driven to market. Instead, the dominant sounds become the creaking of wooden shutters in the wind, the occasional cry of someone searching for missing family members, and the constant tolling of church bells. These bells, once rung to mark the hours of prayer and celebration, now serve as a grim metronome counting the dead. In an effort to contain the spread, city officials order homes to be boarded up, trapping sick families inside to prevent further infection. But with no clear understanding of how the disease spreads, these measures do little to slow its relentless advance. People flee the cities in large numbers, retreating to the countryside in hopes of escaping the sickness. This, unfortunately, only helps carry the disease to new places. the quarantine measures implemented by medieval authorities, while well-intentioned, often created more suffering than they prevented. Families found themselves imprisoned in their own homes with sick relatives, forced to watch helplessly as the disease claimed one member after another. Food and water became scarce for those trapped inside, and many who might have survived the plague itself died from starvation or dehydration. The practice of marking infected houses with crosses or other symbols created a visible map of the disease's progress through the city. But it also stigmatized entire neighborhoods and made it nearly impossible for residents to obtain help from the outside. City officials, many of whom were merchants or guild leaders with no medical training, made decisions based on prevailing theories about disease that seem almost fantastical today. They ordered the burning of aromatic woods in public squares, believing that strong smells could purify the air. They banned the slaughter of animals within city walls, thinking that blood and offal attracted the pestilence. Some cities went so far as to forbid the ringing of church bells for the dead, worried that the constant tolling was spreading fear and somehow making the plague worse. The economy begins to grind to a halt. With so many people falling ill or dying, there are fewer hands to harvest crops, fewer merchants to trade goods, and fewer craftsmen to produce daily necessities. Food becomes scarce. Prices fluctuate wildly. For those left behind, every trip to the market becomes a calculated risk. The economic disruption caused by the Black Death was perhaps as devastating as the disease itself. Agricultural communities, which formed the foundation of medieval society, found themselves unable to plant or harvest crops as entire families succumbed to the plague. Fields that had been carefully tended for generations were left to grow wild, with grain rotting unharvested and livestock wandering unattended through abandoned farms. The seasonal rhythms that had governed rural life for centuries were completely disrupted. In the cities, the guild system that regulated trade and craftsmanship began to collapse. Master craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills died before they could pass their knowledge to apprentices. Workshops that had operated continuously for generations suddenly stood empty, their tools gathering dust and their trade secrets dying with their owners. The intricate network of suppliers, manufacturers, and merchants that kept goods flowing through medieval Europe was severed in countless places, creating shortages of everything from basic tools to luxury items. The disruption to trade routes was equally catastrophic. Merchant caravans that might have traveled for months to bring goods from distant markets found their destinations decimated by plague. Ships arrived at ports to find harbors empty and docks abandoned. The letters of credit and complex financial arrangements that facilitated long-distance trade became worthless when the merchants who had issued them were dead. Even the roads themselves became dangerous as desperate survivors turned to banditry, preying on the few remaining travelers brave enough to venture between cities. Currency itself became problematic during the plague years. Coins that had changed hands thousands of times were suddenly viewed with suspicion, as people worried that money might carry the disease. Some communities reverted to barter systems, trading goods directly rather than using metal currency. The shortage of skilled workers meant that even basic repairs to buildings and infrastructure were impossible, leading to a general decay in the physical environment that would take decades to reverse. Burial practices changed too. Cemeteries filled quickly, forcing towns to dig mass graves. Grave diggers, once considered lowly workers, become some of the most in-demand people in the city, though many refuse the job out of fear. Clergy and doctors alike fall ill at alarming rates, leaving communities with few resources to care for the sick or provide spiritual comfort to the dying. The traditional rituals surrounding death, which had provided comfort and structure to medieval communities for centuries, became impossible to maintain during the peak of the plague. Individual burial plots, carefully marked with stones or wooden crosses, gave way to enormous trenches where bodies were laid in layers and covered with lime to slow decomposition. The elaborate funeral masses that had honored the dead were replaced by hurried services, if any service was provided at all. Grave diggers, who had previously worked alone or in small groups, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of their task. Those who continued in the profession could demand enormous wages, making them among the wealthiest members of their communities, despite the gruesome nature of their work. Some cities had to conscript prisoners or force citizens to take turns digging graves, as the alternative was allowing bodies to pile up in the streets, creating an even greater health hazard. The clergy, who were expected to provide last rites and comfort to the dying, faced an impossible situation. Many priests and monks died while ministering to plague victims, leaving entire parishes without spiritual leadership. Those who survived were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of people seeking confession and absolution. Some began offering general absolution to large groups of people at once, while others abandoned their posts entirely, fleeing to remote monasteries or retreating into private prayer. The few doctors and physicians available during this period found themselves equally helpless against the disease. Medieval medicine, based largely on the theory of bodily humors and influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, had no effective treatments for the plague. Doctors tried bloodletting, applying heated cups to draw out bad humors, and prescribing various herbal remedies, but nothing seemed to slow the disease's progress. Many physicians died while treating patients, and those who survived often questioned everything they had been taught about medicine and healing. Amid all this, rumors swirl. Some people believe the air itself has turned poisonous, leading to the practice of carrying small pouches of herbs or flowers near the nose to ward off what they call bad air. Others blame outsiders, witches, or divine punishment for the city's suffering. Fear deepens social divides, and trust between neighbors starts to crumble. The search for explanations and someone to blame led to some of the darkest chapters in European history. Jewish communities, already marginalized in medieval society, became convenient scapegoats for the plague's spread. Accusations spread that Jewish people had poisoned wells or somehow brought the curse upon Christian communities. These false accusations led to horrific pogroms across Europe, with entire Jewish quarters being burned and their residents murdered by mobs, seeking someone to hold responsible for their suffering. Other minority groups faced similar persecution. Romani people, beggars, and anyone who seemed foreign or different became targets of suspicion. Even within established communities, neighbors began to view each other with mistrust. Families that had lived side by side for generations suddenly found themselves accused of witchcraft or blamed for bringing the plague to their neighborhood. The social fabric that had held medieval communities together began to unravel under the pressure of fear and desperation. The concept of miasma, or bad air, became a dominant explanation for the plague's spread. People believed that corrupted atmosphere caused disease, leading to elaborate rituals designed to purify the air around them. Fires burned constantly in public squares, fed with aromatic woods and herbs that were thought to cleanse the environment. Windows were sealed shut to prevent bad air from entering homes, ironically creating conditions that may have made the spread of pneumonic plague more likely. Some turned to extreme religious practices, believing that the plague was divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves and calling for repentance. They attracted followers who believed that physical suffering might appease God's wrath and end the pestilence. These processions, while providing a sense of community action against the plague, also helped spread the disease as people gathered in large groups to witness the spectacle. Despite the darkness of this time, moments of quiet perseverance still emerge. Some families care for their sick loved ones as best they can, even knowing the risks. A few brave physicians continue to make house calls, offering what little comfort they can provide. Community leaders organize what limited relief efforts are possible, though the scale of the tragedy overwhelms even their best intentions. Acts of heroism and compassion during the plague years provide glimpses of human dignity amid the chaos. Some individuals dedicated themselves completely to caring for plague victims, knowing that they were almost certainly signing their own death warrants. Nuns and monks who remained at their posts continued to tend to the sick and dying, providing not just medical care, but emotional and spiritual support during people's final hours. In some communities, wealthy citizens organized relief efforts, using their personal fortunes to provide food and medicine for the poor. These efforts were often small in scale compared to the enormous need, but they represented important attempts to maintain social bonds and mutual support during the crisis. Guilds that still functioned sometimes took care of the widows and orphans of their deceased members, creating informal support networks that helped some families survive the worst periods of the plague. Individual acts of kindness also persisted throughout the plague years. Neighbors who could have focused solely on their own survival sometimes shared food with families in need. Parents continued to tell stories to their children and sing lullabies to help them sleep, maintaining small rituals of normal life even as the world around them collapsed. Some people kept detailed records of the plague's progress, creating chronicles that would later help historians understand this period. These writers often noted not just the grim statistics of death and suffering, but also the small moments of beauty and human connection that persisted even in the darkest times. By the time the first wave of the Black Death passes, it's estimated that up to half the population in some cities has been lost. Entire neighborhoods stand empty. Weeds grow tall along once busy streets. The city feels hollow, as if holding its breath, waiting for life to return. The demographic catastrophe caused by the Black Death was unprecedented in European history. Some regions lost even more than half their population, with certain towns and villages being completely abandoned. The survivors found themselves living in a world that was fundamentally different from the one they had known before the plague arrived. Entire social classes had been decimated, with some noble families dying out completely, while others found their traditional sources of labor and income gone forever. The physical landscape of Europe bore the scars of the plague for decades afterward. Churches stood half-built, their construction abandoned when the craftsmen and funding disappeared. Bridges collapsed and roads deteriorated as there were not enough people left to maintain the infrastructure that had taken centuries to build. Fields that had been cultivated for generations returned to forest, and entire villages were swallowed by advancing vegetation. The psychological impact on survivors was equally profound. Many struggled with what we might now recognize as survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many others had died. The random nature of the plague's victims challenged medieval understanding of divine justice and moral order. Good and evil people died with equal frequency, and no amount of prayer or righteous living seemed to provide protection against the disease. Over the coming years, the impact of the pandemic will reshape almost every aspect of life in Europe. Labor shortages will shift the balance of power between workers and landowners. Attitudes toward religion, medicine, and mortality will evolve. Architecture, art, and even language will carry the imprint of this dark chapter for generations. The labor shortage created by the Black Death fundamentally altered the relationship between workers and employers throughout Europe. Surviving peasants and craftsmen found themselves in unprecedented demand, able to negotiate higher wages and better working conditions than had been possible for centuries. The rigid feudal system that had bound agricultural workers to the land began to break down as landowners competed for the services of the remaining population. This shift in economic power led to social upheaval that continued long after the plague had passed. Peasant revolts erupted across Europe as workers demanded rights and freedoms that had been unthinkable before the population collapse. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and similar uprisings in France and other countries were direct consequences of the changed social dynamics created by the plague. Traditional authorities found themselves unable to maintain control over populations that had become scarce and therefore valuable. The plague also accelerated changes in technology and agricultural practices. With fewer people available to work the land, innovations that increased productivity became essential for survival. New plowing techniques, crop rotation systems, and labor-saving devices were developed and adopted more quickly than they might have been in normal circumstances. The necessity of doing more work with fewer people drove innovation in ways that would benefit European societies for centuries to come. Religious institutions faced a crisis of authority and belief that would have lasting consequences. The failure of prayers and religious rituals to stop the plague led many people to question traditional teachings about divine providence and the nature of God's relationship with humanity. Some turned to more mystical or personal forms of spirituality, while others became increasingly secular in their outlook. The Catholic Church's authority was weakened by the obvious helplessness of its clergy in the face of the pandemic, creating conditions that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. Art and literature, produced in the aftermath of the Black Death, reflected a new preoccupation with mortality and the fragility of human life. The memento mori tradition, which reminded viewers that death could come at any moment, became increasingly common in painting and sculpture. Literature began to explore themes of social criticism and moral complexity that had been less prominent before the plague. The Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer in the decades following the Black Death, reflects many of these new attitudes and concerns. The plague also had profound effects on urban planning and public health measures. Cities that rebuilt after the devastation often incorporated wider streets and better sanitation systems, though these improvements were based more on practical experience than scientific understanding of disease transmission. The concept of quarantine, while imperfectly applied during the Black Death itself, became an established part of European responses to epidemic disease. Medical practice was transformed by the obvious failure of traditional treatments during the plague years. While effective treatments for the plague itself would not be developed for centuries, the pandemic encouraged more careful observation of symptoms and disease progression. The limitation of theoretical knowledge when faced with real patients became apparent, leading to a gradual shift toward more empirical approaches to medicine. The Black Death also influenced the development of insurance and financial instruments designed to manage risk. Merchants and investors who had seen entire ventures destroyed by the plague began to develop more sophisticated ways of spreading and limiting their exposure to catastrophic losses. These innovations would eventually contribute to the emergence of modern banking and commercial practices. And as we let this scene settle into the background of your imagination, we'll gently leave behind the fear and sorrow that gripped these cities. The survivors of the Black Death had to rebuild not just their communities, but their entire understanding of how the world worked. They had witnessed the collapse of institutions and beliefs that had seemed permanent, and they had learned that human society was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. Yet they did rebuild. In the decades following the plague, European cities slowly came back to life. New families moved into abandoned houses. New craftsmen learned trades that had nearly disappeared, and new communities formed around the spaces left empty by the dead. The Europe that emerged from this reconstruction was different from what had come before, more dynamic, and less bound by tradition, shaped by the knowledge that everything could change in a matter of months. The children who grew up in the post-plague world carried with them stories of the Great Dying, passed down through families who had survived the catastrophe. These stories became part of the cultural memory of medieval Europe, influencing art, literature, and social customs for generations. The experience of the Black Death had taught European societies that they were not masters of their own destiny, that forces beyond their control could reshape their world in ways they could never have predicted. Consider the ordinary objects that tell the story of disrupted lives. In plague-stricken homes, meals were left half-prepared on tables as families fled or fell ill. Bread dough sat rising in bowls until it spoiled and attracted vermin. Looms stood with threads stretched taut, weaving projects abandoned mid-pattern by textile workers who would never return to complete them. Personal letters remained unfinished, their ink still wet when writers succumbed to fever, leaving behind incomplete thoughts and undelivered messages to distant relatives. Children's toys scattered in empty houses spoke to suddenly interrupted lives. Wooden horses lay overturned in chambers where young voices had once filled the air with laughter. Hand-carved dolls sat propped against walls, their painted faces seeming to wait patiently, children who would never return to play with them again. Games of chess remained frozen mid-move, the players having abandoned their strategies for more pressing concerns of survival. The seasonal cycles that had governed medieval life became meaningless during the plague years. Harvest festivals were canceled when there were no crops to celebrate and too few people left to attend. Wedding celebrations that had been planned for months were postponed indefinitely, and many couples who had survived the plague found themselves marrying in small, somber ceremonies rather than the elaborate community festivities that had been traditional. Christmas and Easter observances became muted affairs, marked more by grief for the missing than joy for the season. Schools and centers of learning faced particular challenges during the plague years. Monasteries that had served as repositories of knowledge and learning lost entire communities of scribes and scholars. Manuscript copying, which had been the primary method of preserving and transmitting written knowledge, slowed to a crawl as the learned men who performed this work died or fled. Some texts that existed in only a few copies disappeared forever when their custodians perished, and no one remained who could read or value them properly. The universities that were beginning to emerge across Europe suffered devastating losses. Student populations dwindled as young men either died or were called home to help manage family affairs in crisis. Professors who had spent decades accumulating knowledge died before they could pass their learning to the next generation. Entire fields of study, particularly in medicine and natural philosophy, had to be rebuilt almost from scratch in the years following the plague. Legal systems struggled to function during the crisis. Courts could not convene when judges, lawyers, and witnesses were dead or scattered. Property disputes became common as inheritance laws struggled to cope with situations where entire family lines had been extinguished. Some properties changed hands multiple times as successive owners died, creating complex legal tangles that took decades to resolve. Wills and testaments written hastily during the plague years often proved inadequate to handle the unprecedented situation of mass mortality. The plague created entirely new social categories of people. Plague orphans, children who had lost both parents to the disease, became a significant population requiring care and attention. Some were taken in by relatives or neighbors, but many found themselves living in ad hoc communities of other orphans, struggling to survive through begging, theft, or whatever work they could find. These children grew up without the traditional family structures that had shaped medieval society, creating a generation with different values and expectations. Plague widows faced particular challenges in a society that had been structured around male authority and protection. Many found themselves responsible for businesses or properties they had never managed before, forced to learn new skills while grieving their losses. Some discovered unexpected strength and capability, becoming successful merchants or landowners in their own right. Others struggled with the practical and legal challenges of operating in a world that had not been designed for independent women. The mobility of people during and after the plague created new forms of community that transcended traditional geographic boundaries. Survivors who had fled their home regions sometimes formed settlements with other refugees, creating mixed communities of people from different backgrounds who shared the common experience of plague survival. These new settlements often developed unique customs and practices that blended traditions from their various members' original homes. Marriage patterns changed dramatically in the post-plague world. With so many potential partners dead, people often married outside their traditional social classes or geographic regions. Age differences between spouses became more pronounced as survivors took what partners they could find. Some communities experienced marriage shortages, with significantly more women than men or vice versa, leading to unconventional family arrangements and inheritance patterns. The concept of time itself seemed to change during the plague years. The normal progression of seasons, which had provided structure and meaning to medieval life, became less relevant when basic survival required constant attention. People stopped making long-term plans, focusing instead on immediate needs like finding food and avoiding infection. The future, which had once been anticipated through careful preparation and seasonal planning, became something too uncertain to contemplate. Trade relationships that had taken generations to establish were severed permanently during the plague years. Merchant families who had maintained connections across Europe for decades found their networks destroyed when their partners and contacts died. Some trade routes were abandoned entirely and never re-established, while others shifted to new paths as surviving merchants sought out new markets and suppliers. The spice trade, silk commerce, and other luxury goods markets were particularly disrupted, as these items seemed less essential when basic survival was at stake. Military campaigns and political conflicts were suspended or abandoned during the plague years. Armies could not be maintained when soldiers were dying of disease faster than they could die in battle. Some wars simply ended through attrition, with neither side having enough men left to continue fighting. The English siege of Calais was lifted partly because plague had devastated both the besieging army and the city's defenders. Political alliances shifted as noble families died out and new leaders emerged from the chaos. The treatment of animals changed during the plague years. Domestic animals that had been valued members of household communities were sometimes abandoned when their owners died or fled. Packs of feral dogs roamed empty cities, while cattle and sheep wandered unattended through abandoned farmland. Some animals were killed out of superstition, as people blamed them for carrying the disease. Cats, which might have helped control the rat populations that actually carried plague-infected fleas, were often killed based on their association with witchcraft and evil. Communication between communities became increasingly difficult as traditional messenger services broke down. Letters took weeks or months longer to deliver as postal routes were disrupted. Families separated by the chaos of the plague years sometimes lost contact permanently, never learning the fate of distant relatives. News of major events traveled slowly and often arrived garbled, contributing to the sense of isolation and uncertainty that characterized the plague years. The natural environment began to reclaim human settlements with remarkable speed. Gardens that had been carefully tended for generations were quickly overrun by weeds and wild plants. Fruit trees went unpruned, and their produce rotted on the ground, attracting insects and animals that had previously been kept at bay by human activity. Wells and water sources became contaminated without regular maintenance, forcing the few remaining residents to search for new sources of clean water. Artistic and cultural traditions faced extinction as the communities that had preserved them disappeared. Folk songs that had been passed down orally for generations were lost when the singers died. Traditional crafts that required master-apprentice relationships for transmission disappeared when there were no masters left to teach them. Regional dialects and languages evolved rapidly as isolated communities developed their own ways of speaking, cut off from the standardizing influence of broader cultural contact. The psychological landscape of post-plague Europe was marked by a new awareness of mortality and fragility. People who had survived the pandemic carried with them a different relationship to death and loss. They had seen healthy individuals die within days, watched entire communities disappear, and learned that no amount of wealth, status, or virtue provided guaranteed protection against catastrophe. This knowledge influenced everything from personal relationships to business decisions to artistic expression. Religious practices evolved in response to the plague experience. Some communities developed new rituals and traditions, specifically related to epidemic disease, creating prayers and ceremonies designed to prevent future outbreaks. Others incorporated plague imagery into their existing religious art and architecture, creating visual reminders of the pandemic's impact. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, became a popular artistic motif that depicted death as the great equalizer, taking rich and poor, young and old, powerful and weak with equal indifference. The relationship between the living and the dead underwent fundamental changes during the plague years. Traditional mourning periods, which had allowed families time to properly grieve their losses, became impossible when death occurred so frequently and suddenly. Funeral rites that had once involved the entire community were reduced to hurried burials attended by only the most essential participants. The elaborate tomb monuments that wealthy families had commissioned to preserve their memory were left unfinished when the sculptors died, leaving stone figures trapped in various stages of completion. Dreams and sleep patterns changed for plague survivors. Many reported nightmares filled with images of disease and death, reliving traumatic memories of watching loved ones succumb to the pestilence. Others experienced insomnia, afraid to sleep lest they wake to find themselves developing plague symptoms. Some survivors claimed to receive visitations from deceased family members in their dreams, leading to new folk beliefs about the spirits of plague victims and their ability to communicate with the living. The sounds of cities transformed permanently after the plague. The absence of human voices created an acoustic landscape dominated by natural sounds that had previously been masked by urban activity. Wind through empty buildings created eerie whistling and groaning noises that survivors found deeply unsettling. Birds and small animals, no longer frightened away by constant human presence, began to inhabit abandoned structures, their calls echoing through empty streets and vacant houses. Food preparation and preservation methods evolved out of necessity during the plague years. With traditional supply chains disrupted and fewer people available to process and preserve food, communities had to develop new techniques for maintaining nutrition with limited resources. Some learned to identify and use wild plants that had previously been ignored, expanding their diets to include foods that would have been considered peasant fare before the crisis. Others developed new methods of smoking, salting, and drying foods to make small quantities last longer. The concept of privacy and personal space changed dramatically in post-plague communities. With so many houses standing empty, survivors often had access to larger living spaces than they had ever known before. Some families moved into grander homes that had belonged to plague victims, creating a strange social mobility based on death rather than achievement. The psychological adjustment to living in spaces that still contained the possessions and memories of their former inhabitants proved challenging for many survivors. Weather patterns seemed to take on new significance for plague survivors, who had learned to associate changes in atmosphere with the spread of disease. Fog and mist, which had once been simply natural phenomena, became sources of anxiety for people who believed that corrupted air carried the pestilence. Hot, still days reminded survivors of the fever that had claimed so many lives, while sudden storms seemed to promise either purification or further catastrophe, depending on the observer's state of mind. The practice of medicine became increasingly experimental in the post-plague world. Traditional treatments having proved useless against the disease, some practitioners began trying entirely new approaches based on observation rather than ancient texts. They studied the few people who had survived plague infection, trying to understand what might have made them different from those who died. Some began keeping detailed records of symptoms and treatments, creating the foundation for more systematic approaches to understanding disease. The boundaries between public and private property became blurred during the plague years. Empty houses were sometimes occupied by survivors who had lost their own homes, creating complex questions about ownership and rights. Public spaces like markets and squares were taken over by private individuals who used them for personal purposes when official authority broke down. Some communities had to completely re-establish property laws and boundaries when they began to recover from the plague's devastation. The plague created new forms of superstition and magical thinking that persisted long after the disease had passed. Survivors developed elaborate rituals and beliefs designed to prevent the return of the pestilence. From carrying specific herbs or stones to performing daily ceremonies that they believed would keep them safe. Some objects that had belonged to plague victims were considered cursed and were avoided or destroyed, while others were thought to carry protective powers for those who had survived the disease. But there is another kind of memory, preserved in the ground itself, buried beneath the layers of time and earth that accumulated over the centuries that followed. The cities that died and were reborn left traces of their ordeal in the archaeological record, waiting to be discovered by future generations, who would approach these remnants with tools and techniques that medieval people could never have imagined. Beneath the layers of soil, stone, and time itself, a hidden world waits to be uncovered. A place where archaeologists centuries later would carefully unearth the forgotten walls, streets, and homes that once stood here. In the foundations of buildings that were abandoned during the plague years, in the hasty mass graves that were dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of dead, in the layers of ash from the fires that burned to purify the air, the physical evidence of this great transformation lies preserved. The trowels and brushes of modern archaeologists would reveal not just the bones and artifacts of plague victims, but the entire material culture of a society in crisis. They would find coins hidden in walls by families who hoped to return and reclaim their wealth, tools abandoned in workshops by craftsmen who never came back, and the remains of hastily constructed barriers meant to keep the sick away from the healthy. Each layer of earth would tell part of the story, creating a three-dimensional archive of human experience during one of history's greatest catastrophes. Let's step into the next part of our journey, the lost walls beneath London, unearthing the old city. As the noise of the crowded streets and the echoes of distant church bells fade from your mind, imagine shifting your focus downward. Beneath the modern city, far below the hum of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights, lies a layered history, hidden in soil and stone. The London that millions know today is built atop centuries of other Londons. Beneath familiar landmarks like the Tower of London or St. Paul's Cathedral, traces of earlier streets, homes, and defenses remain quietly buried. It's a hidden landscape that only reveals itself in fleeting moments, during construction projects, planned excavations, or sometimes by accident when a foundation is dug too deep. Picture the moment when a construction worker's shovel strikes something unexpected. The metallic clang echoes through the worksite as concrete dust settles around a fragment of ancient stone. What appears at first to be merely an obstruction soon reveals itself as something far more significant, a piece of history that has waited centuries to see daylight again. These discoveries happen more often than most people realize. Each year, dozens of archaeological sites emerge across London, from tiny residential gardens where homeowners stumble upon Roman pottery while planting roses, to massive commercial developments that uncover entire sections of forgotten neighborhoods. The scale of preservation beneath London's surface defies imagination. Waterlogged conditions in certain areas have created natural time capsules, where organic materials that would normally decay have survived in remarkable condition. Leather shoes still bear the impressions of feet that wore them 700 years ago. Wooden bowls retain their smooth, carved surfaces. Textile fragments preserve colors and weaving patterns that speak to the skilled hands of medieval craftspeople. The anaerobic environment created by centuries of accumulated sediment has essentially mummified these objects, offering modern researchers an unprecedented window into daily life across the ages. The oldest layers belong to the Romans. Around 2,000 years ago, they founded Londinium along the banks of the River Thames. The Roman wall, parts of which still survive in basements and museum displays, once encircled the city, offering both protection and a clear boundary between the urban and the wild. Its stones are rough, uneven, and darkened with age. But the story of Roman Londinium extends far beyond its protective barriers. Recent excavations have revealed a sophisticated urban infrastructure that rivals modern city planning. An intricate network of roads, paved with carefully fitted stones, connected residential districts to commercial centers. These streets were engineered with subtle gradients that directed rainwater toward drainage systems lined with precisely cut stone channels. The Romans understood that a thriving city required more than walls. It needed systems to manage waste, transport goods, and provide clean water to its inhabitants. The forum that once stood at the heart of Roman London covered an area roughly equivalent to Trafalgar Square today. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of its massive columns, each one carved from imported marble that traveled hundreds of miles to reach this northern outpost of the empire. The basilica that dominated one side of the forum served as both courthouse and meeting hall, its soaring roof supported by engineering techniques that wouldn't be seen again in Britain for centuries after the Romans departed. Evidence of Roman domestic life emerges in the form of hypocaust systems, the ancient equivalent of central heating. These ingenious networks of hollow walls and raised floors allowed heated air to circulate through buildings, keeping wealthy Romans comfortable during London's damp winters. The discovery of these systems, often found intact beneath modern office buildings, reveals not just technological sophistication, but also social stratification. Only the most prosperous residents could afford such luxuries, while the majority of Londinium's population made do with simple braziers and shared communal baths. The remnants of these public baths provide particularly rich archaeological evidence. Elaborate mosaics, their tiny colored tiles still arranged in geometric patterns, once decorated changing rooms and relaxation areas. Lead pipes that carried hot water-bearer inscriptions, identifying the craftsmen who installed them. Even the mortar between stones contains valuable information, as its composition reveals which quarries supplied materials and how construction techniques evolved over the decades of Roman occupation. As the centuries passed, the Saxons arrived. Then the Normans, each group reshaping the city to fit their needs. Timber houses rose and fell. Markets expanded. Defensive structures like the medieval city wall were reinforced, rebuilt, and occasionally abandoned. The Saxon settlement that grew from the ruins of Roman Londinium tells a story of adaptation and survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that rather than simply occupying existing Roman structures, the Saxons chose to build their own community slightly west of the old Romang center. This new settlement, which they called Londonwic, stretched along the riverbank in an area that roughly corresponds to modern Covent Garden and the Strand. The shift in location reflects both practical considerations and cultural preferences. The Saxons favored timber construction over Roman stone, preferring buildings that could be easily modified or relocated as needs changed. Excavations in this Saxon area have uncovered evidence of a thriving trading center. Fragments of pottery from as far away as the Rhineland and northern France indicate that London maintained its importance as a commercial hub even after the collapse of Roman administration. Glass beads from Scandinavia, amber from the Baltic, and silver coins from Frankish territories all point to a merchant community that connected Britain to the broader European economy. The distribution of these imported goods throughout Saxon London suggests society where wealth was more evenly distributed than it would become in later centuries. The transition from Saxon to Norman rule brought dramatic changes to London's physical landscape. The Normans arrived with architectural ambitions that required stone on an unprecedented scale. Westminster Abbey, begun under Saxon rule but completed by Norman builders, became a testament to the new regime's power and permanence. The Tower of London, whose imposing white tower still dominates the eastern edge of the city, represented Norman military engineering at its most sophisticated. These grand projects were only the most visible expressions of a comprehensive urban transformation. Norman London witnessed the development of specialized craft districts that would define the city's character for centuries to come. Archaeological evidence from Cheapside reveals the workshops of goldsmiths and metalworkers, their furnaces built into the foundations of timber-framed buildings. The discovery of crucibles still containing traces of precious metals, along with unfinished jewelry and decorative objects, provides insight into the techniques and artistic sensibilities of Norman craftspeople. These workshops weren't isolated enterprises, but formed part of organized guilds that controlled quality, training, and prices within their respective trades. The Norman period also saw the first systematic efforts to manage London's growth through regulation and planning. Property boundaries were formalized, creating the pattern of narrow plots that still characterizes much of the City of London today. Archaeological evidence from this period includes boundary markers, drainage ditches, and even early examples of building regulations enforced through standardized measurements and construction techniques. Archaeologists working beneath London often describe their experience as peeling back layers of a dense, complicated book. Each chapter tells a story of a different era, but many pages overlap. Roman coins sometimes rest beneath Saxon pottery. Fragments of medieval leather shoes lie pressed between broken Tudor tiles and Victorian bricks. Every layer holds pieces of lives once lived. This layering creates unique interpretive challenges that require both scientific precision and imaginative reconstruction. When archaeologists find a medieval cooking pot containing Roman coins, they must determine whether this represents continuity of use across centuries, evidence of medieval collectors who valued ancient artifacts, or simply the random mixture that occurs when later builders disturb earlier deposits. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis provide some answers, but much remains tantalizingly uncertain. The concept of stratigraphy, borrowed from geology, allows archaeologists to read these layers like pages in a book. Each distinct layer represents a specific period of human activity, marked by characteristic building materials, pottery styles, and burial practices. But London's stratigraphy is complicated by the fact that the city has never been completely abandoned and rebuilt. Instead, it represents continuous occupation and modification spanning 2 millennia. This continuity means that finding perfectly undisturbed layers is rare. Most archaeological contexts show evidence of later intrusion, whether from medieval cellars dug into Roman foundations or Victorian sewers that cut through Saxon settlements. The challenge becomes even more complex when dealing with areas that have been repeatedly modified for different purposes. A site that began as a Roman residential district might later have served as a Saxon marketplace, then a Norman church, followed by Tudor workshops, Georgian housing, and modern office buildings. Each phase of occupation leaves its mark, but separating these influences requires careful analysis of construction techniques, artifact assemblages, and documentary evidence. Modern techniques have revolutionized the ability to extract information from these complex archaeological contexts. Ground-penetrating radar can map buried foundations without excavation, allowing archaeologists to understand site layouts before breaking ground. Chemical analysis of soil samples reveals ancient industrial activities through the presence of metalworking residues, dye compounds, or food preparation byproducts. Even microscopic analysis of mortar and plaster can identify specific quarry sources and construction dates with remarkable precision. One of the most fascinating discoveries is how the city's footprint has shifted over time. Old walls that once stood at the city's edge now sit deep beneath the current urban core. Streets have been realigned, rivers redirected, and entire neighborhoods built atop earlier ruins. During quiet moments inside excavation sites, workers sometimes pause and imagine the thousands of footsteps that passed over these stones long before modern London existed. The medieval expansion beyond the Roman walls represents one of the most significant transformations in London's development. As trade and population grew during the 12th and 13th centuries, the old Roman boundaries became insufficient to contain the city's economic activities. Suburbs developed along major roads leading out from the city gates, creating linear settlements that followed ancient trackways toward Westminster, Southwark, and the Eastern Docks. Archaeological evidence from these expanding areas reveals a different character from the dense urban core within the walls. Houses were larger and set in more spacious plots, often with substantial gardens that provided both food and raw materials for domestic crafts. Excavations in areas like Aldgate and Bishopsgate have uncovered evidence of tanning operations, brewing, and textile production on a scale that would have been impossible within the confined space of the walled city. The discovery of medieval field systems beneath modern London suburbs provides particularly compelling evidence of this expansion. Parallel ditches that once marked property boundaries can still be traced beneath housing estates in areas like Stepney and Whitechapel. These agricultural plots supported a growing population and supplied fresh produce to urban markets. The transition from farmland to suburb often happened gradually, with individual plots being sold off for development, while neighboring fields remained in cultivation. Water management played a crucial role in this medieval expansion. The system of streams and rivers that drained the Thames Valley required careful management as urban development increased. Archaeological evidence includes the remains of mill races, fish ponds, and flood defenses that allowed communities to harness water power while protecting property from seasonal flooding. Some of these water features persist today as street names like Fleet Street and Holborn, preserving the memory of streams that were gradually covered over as the city expanded. The Great Fire of 1666 created an archaeological horizon that allows researchers to distinguish clearly between medieval and post-medieval London. The intense heat of the fire transformed pottery, metalwork, and building materials, creating distinctive markers that appear consistently across fire-affected areas. This catastrophic event, while devastating for contemporary Londoners, provides modern archaeologists with a valuable chronological anchor. Material found beneath fire debris can be confidently dated to before 1666, while deposits above this layer reflect the subsequent rebuilding efforts. Post-fire reconstruction, directed in part by Christopher Wren and other renowned architects, introduced new building standards and street layouts that are still evident today. Archaeological excavations in the city reveal the systematic nature of this rebuilding, with standardized brick sizes, improved foundation techniques, and coordinated infrastructure development. The archaeological record shows how lessons learned from the fire influenced construction practices, with greater use of stone and brick, wider streets, and improved fire breaks between buildings. Among the most significant finds are remnants of the medieval city wall itself. In places like Tower Hill and near London Wall Road, sections of stone and mortar still stand, scarred but solid. Some of these walls were built in response to threats like Viking raids, while others simply marked property boundaries or provided structure for expanding marketplaces. The medieval city wall represents one of the largest and most complex archaeological monuments in London. Built in phases between the 13th and 15th centuries, it incorporated sections of the Roman wall while extending the defensive perimeter to encompass the growing city. Recent conservation work has revealed construction techniques that show both continuity with Roman engineering traditions and innovations developed by medieval builders. Analysis of the wall's mortar composition indicates that builders used materials from multiple sources, suggesting both local quarrying operations and importation of specialized stones for particular purposes. The discovery of masons' marks carved into individual blocks provides evidence of the organized workforce that constructed these defenses. Some marks identify specific craftsmen, while others indicate payment systems or quality control measures. These details offer rare insights into the organization of large-scale medieval construction projects. The wall's defensive features evolved in response to changing military technology. Early sections designed to resist Viking raids emphasized height and solid construction, while later additions incorporated features intended to counter new siege weapons and tactics. Arrow loops, murder holes, and carefully positioned gates reflect sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture. Archaeological investigation of these features, combined with documentary evidence, reveals how military engineering adapted to new threats throughout the medieval period. But the wall served purposes beyond defense. Large sections functioned as property boundaries, commercial zones, and even foundations for buildings. Archaeological evidence shows that merchants built shops and workshops directly against the wall's inner face, taking advantage of its solid construction to support multi-story buildings. The space between wall sections often became marketplaces or storage areas, creating a complex urban environment that maximized the use of available land. The discovery of gates and posterns provides evidence of how the wall controlled, but did not completely restrict movement between the city and its suburbs. These openings were carefully designed to facilitate trade while maintaining security. Archaeological investigation of gate foundations reveals complex systems of portcullises, guard chambers, and toll collection areas. The remains of gate mechanisms, including hinges, locks, and lifting devices, demonstrate the sophisticated engineering required to operate these massive barriers. Maintenance and modification of the wall required continuous effort and investment from the city's government. Archaeological evidence includes the remains of workshops where stonemasons shaped replacement blocks, blacksmiths forged iron reinforcements, and carpenters constructed scaffolding and lifting devices. The discovery of these specialized work areas provides insight into the infrastructure required to maintain such a massive undertaking over several centuries. Beyond the physical structures, archaeologists uncover everyday objects that hint at ordinary lives. Clay pipes once held between the lips of weary laborers. Ceramic jugs, their glazes still faintly visible, once filled with ale or water. Pieces of woven fabric, preserved in waterlogged soil, reveal patterns that were last touched by hand centuries ago. Even animal bones, discarded after meals, help piece together the diets and habits of long-forgotten residents. The study of these mundane objects, known as material culture analysis, reveals aspects of daily life that rarely appear in historical documents. The shape and decoration of pottery vessels indicate not just when they were made, but how they were used, who could afford them, and what they suggest about contemporary cooking practices and social customs. A simple ceramic bowl might seem unremarkable, but its size, wear patterns, and decoration can reveal whether it was used for individual meals or communal serving, whether it was a prized possession or everyday utility, and how its users understood concepts of beauty and craftsmanship. Clay pipes provide particularly rich evidence for social and economic history. The evolution of pipe designs reflects changing smoking habits, trade relationships, and manufacturing techniques. Early pipes were small and simple, reflecting the high cost of imported tobacco and the novelty of smoking. As tobacco became more common and affordable, pipes grew larger and more elaborate, with decorative elements that reflected both personal taste and social status. The discovery of pipe fragments in specific archaeological contexts can indicate the social class of the site's occupants, their participation in global trade networks, and their adoption of new cultural practices. Textile fragments, when they survive, offer unparalleled insights into medieval and post-medieval clothing, household furnishings, and industrial practices. The preservation of organic materials requires very specific conditions, usually involving waterlogged soil that excludes oxygen and prevents decay. When these conditions exist, archaeologists can recover not just the textiles themselves, but also information about dyes, weaving techniques, and even the processing of raw materials like wool and flax. Recent analysis of textile finds from medieval London has revealed the sophistication of the city's cloth trade. Fragments of silk bearing complex patterns indicate connections to Mediterranean and Asian markets. Wool fabrics show evidence of processing techniques that varied by region and date, allowing researchers to trace trade relationships and technological diffusion. Even simple linen fragments can reveal information about domestic production, as the quality of weaving and finishing indicates whether cloth was produced by professional weavers or household members working for family use. The study of animal bones, known as zoocheology, provides detailed information about diet, economy, and environment in past societies. The species represented in bone assemblages reveal what animals were available, which were considered suitable for human consumption, and how different cuts of meat were distributed among various social classes. Butchering marks on bones indicate processing techniques and preferences for particular cuts. The age and gender of animals at the time they were used provides insights into breeding practices and seasonal consumption patterns. Analysis of London's medieval bone assemblages reveals significant changes in diet and economy over time. Early medieval deposits show reliance on cattle, sheep, and pigs, with some wild species like deer and birds supplementing domestic animals. By the later medieval period, the proportion of wild species decreased, while the variety of domestic animals increased, suggesting both population growth and more intensive agricultural practices. The appearance of marine fish bones in inland contexts indicates the development of preservation and transportation systems that allowed fresh and salted fish to reach urban markets. The size and bone structure of domestic animals provides evidence for breeding practices and agricultural intensification. Medieval cattle were generally smaller than modern breeds, but their bones show evidence of selective breeding for particular characteristics. Work animals like oxen show distinctive bone modifications resulting from heavy labor, while dairy cattle exhibit different patterns of wear and development. These details, invisible to casual observation, reveal the complex relationships between urban consumers and rural producers that sustained medieval London's growing population. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect is how little of this buried city the average passerby realizes exists. Beneath glass skyscrapers and busy underground stations, the remnants of older Londons remain. They sit quietly, compressed by time and soil, offering silent testimony to the layers of history that built the modern world. The juxtaposition of ancient and modern creates surreal moments for those who work beneath London's surface. Construction workers installing fiber optic cables find themselves carefully excavating around Roman mosaic floors. Subway maintenance crews discover medieval pottery in tunnels that were blasted through centuries-old deposits. Even routine utility work can reveal unexpected connections to the past, as when a broken water main exposes Saxon timber structures or Victorian sewers cut through Roman foundations. These encounters with buried history occur with remarkable frequency, yet they often remain invisible to the general public. Planning regulations require archaeological investigation before major construction projects, but these surveys typically happen during early phases of development when sites are closed to public access. By the time buildings are completed and occupied, any archaeological discoveries have been either preserved in situ, removed to museums, or carefully documented before being destroyed by construction. The challenge of balancing development pressures with archaeological preservation creates ongoing tensions in a city where space is precious and development costs are enormous. Developers must factor archaeological work into project timelines and budgets, while archaeologists must work quickly to extract maximum information before sites are lost forever. This pressure has led to innovations in archaeological technique, with rapid assessment methods and digital documentation, allowing researchers to process more information in less time. Public awareness of this buried heritage varies dramatically across different areas of London. Residents of the city, where Roman and medieval remains are most commonly encountered, may become familiar with archaeological discoveries through local news coverage or temporary exhibitions. But in outer boroughs, where archaeological finds are less frequent or less spectacular, many people remain unaware of the historical depth beneath their feet. The psychological impact of these discoveries extends beyond their scientific value. For construction workers, archaeologists, and even casual observers, the experience of touching objects that were last handled centuries ago creates a tangible connection to the past that transcends abstract historical knowledge. This physical connection to previous generations can be profoundly moving, as when a medieval shoe is found to contain carefully mended patches that speak to the economic constraints and personal care of its long-dead owner. Today, thanks to careful excavation and preservation efforts, portions of these buried walls are accessible to the public. Small museum displays, guided tours, and interpretive plaques offer glimpses into this hidden world. Yet much still remains untouched, waiting for some future project or curious archaeologist to uncover another piece of the story. The Museum of London and its Docklands branch house extensive collections of archaeological finds that represent only a fraction of what has been discovered beneath the city. Storage facilities contain thousands of artifacts that await detailed analysis, while digital archives preserve documentation from hundreds of excavations conducted over the past several decades. This vast repository of information continues to yield new insights as researchers apply new analytical techniques to previously studied materials. Recent developments in digital archaeology have transformed how these buried landscapes are understood and presented to the public. Three-dimensional modeling allows researchers to reconstruct entire buildings from fragmentary foundations, while virtual reality experiences enable visitors to walk through accurate recreations of Roman streets or medieval marketplaces. These technologies make archaeological discoveries accessible to audiences who might never visit traditional museum displays, extending the educational impact of London's buried heritage. Community archaeology projects have begun to involve local residents in the process of discovery and interpretation. Schools collaborate with professional archaeologists to excavate sites in their neighborhoods, giving students hands-on experience with historical research while contributing to scientific knowledge. Adult volunteers assist with processing finds, cataloging artifacts, and even conducting limited excavations under professional supervision. These programs help build public appreciation for archaeological work, while providing valuable assistance to understaffed research projects. The legal framework surrounding archaeological discovery continues to evolve as the volume of finds increases and preservation challenges become more complex. The Treasure Act requires reporting of significant finds, while planning regulations mandate archaeological assessment for major developments. But these formal requirements represent only part of a broader conversation about how society should balance development needs with heritage preservation. International collaboration has become increasingly important as researchers recognize that London's archaeological record reflects connections to broader European and global networks. Roman artifacts found in London often have parallels in excavations across the former empire, allowing researchers to trace trade routes, artistic influences, and technological diffusion across vast distances. Medieval finds similarly connect London to continental European developments in craft production, architectural styles, and urban planning. The application of scientific techniques to archaeological materials continues to reveal new information about ancient London. Isotope analysis can determine where individuals were born and what they ate, even from skeletal remains that are centuries old. DNA analysis of both human and animal remains provides information about population movements, breeding practices, and disease prevalence. Even seemingly mundane materials like mortar and pottery can yield scientific data about ancient trade relationships, technological processes, and environmental conditions. Climate change adds urgency to archaeological preservation efforts, as rising groundwater levels and increased flooding threaten waterlogged deposits that have preserved organic materials for centuries. Sites that have remained stable for hundreds of years may deteriorate rapidly if their environmental conditions change. This challenge requires new approaches to both excavation and preservation, with some archaeologists arguing for more aggressive recovery of threatened sites, while others advocate for improved in-situ protection. The economic value of London's archaeological heritage extends beyond its cultural and educational significance. Heritage tourism brings millions of visitors to London annually, many of whom are specifically interested in the city's historical layers. Archaeological sites and museums contribute to local economies while raising international awareness of London's historical importance. This economic dimension provides additional justification for preservation efforts, demonstrating that archaeological heritage represents both cultural treasure and practical investment. Future archaeological work in London will likely focus increasingly on sites outside the historic core. As development pressure spreads to previously industrial or residential areas where archaeological investigation has been limited, these areas may contain evidence of activities and populations that are poorly represented in the archaeological record from central London. Suburban excavations might reveal more about common people's lives, specialized industries, and the connections between London and its rural hinterland. The riverside areas of medieval London present particularly rich opportunities for archaeological investigation. The Thames foreshore, exposed at low tide, continues to yield artifacts eroded from ancient riverbank settlements. Mudlarks, licensed treasure hunters who search the river's edge, regularly discover medieval pilgrim badges, Tudor shoes, and Georgian clay pipes. These finds complement formal excavations by providing evidence of how Londoners used and discarded objects in their daily lives. The river served not just as a highway for commerce, but as a repository for the detritus of urban life, preserving materials that might otherwise have been lost to recycling or decay. Waterfront archaeology reveals the sophisticated engineering required to manage London's relationship with the Thames. Medieval wharves were complex structures that had to withstand both tidal action and the weight of loaded ships. Archaeological investigation of these installations uncovers evidence of carpentry techniques, timber selection, and maintenance practices that kept the port functioning across centuries of use. The discovery of ships' timbers reused in wharf construction provides information about vessel design and the economics of maritime recycling. The plague pits of medieval and early modern London represent some of the most poignant archaeological discoveries in the city. These mass burial sites, created during epidemics when normal burial practices became impossible, contain the remains of thousands of individuals who died during disease outbreaks. Careful excavation of these sites provides valuable information about medieval medicine, urban demographics, and social responses to crisis. Skeletal analysis can identify specific diseases, nutritional status, and even occupational hazards that affected different segments of London's population. Recent excavations at the Bedlam Cemetery, associated with the famous psychiatric hospital, have revealed not just the remains of patients, but also evidence of changing attitudes toward mental illness and social care. The burial practices, personal effects, and even the arrangement of graves provide insights into how medieval and early modern society treated its most vulnerable members. These discoveries challenge simplified narratives about historical attitudes toward disability and mental health, revealing complex systems of care and neglect that varied by period and social class. The Jewish quarter of medieval London, centered around Old Jewry, provides archaeological evidence of a community that left little trace in the historical record after their expulsion in 1290. Excavations have uncovered ritual baths, dietary implements, and even fragments of Hebrew inscriptions that illuminate the daily lives of London's medieval Jewish population. These finds are particularly significant because they represent physical evidence of communities whose history was largely erased from official records. The archaeological record preserves aspects of religious practice, commercial activity, and domestic life that help reconstruct the experience of religious minorities in medieval England. Monastic archaeology represents another dimension of London's buried heritage. The city once contained dozens of religious houses, from small priories to major establishments like Westminster Abbey. The dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII led to the destruction or conversion of these sites, but their foundations often survive beneath later construction. Archaeological investigation of monastic sites reveals not just religious practices, but also the economic activities that sustain these communities. Monastic houses operated mills, maintained fish ponds, produced crafts, and managed extensive agricultural holdings that connected them to the broader urban economy. The discovery of medieval hospitals and charitable institutions adds another layer to understanding London's social infrastructure. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, founded in the 12th century, has been continuously occupied for nearly 900 years. But archaeological investigation has revealed earlier phases of construction and use that are invisible in the current buildings. The remains of medieval wards, kitchens, and burial grounds provide evidence of medical practices, charitable giving, and social attitudes toward poverty and illness. Industrial archaeology in London extends back much further than the famous Victorian factories and warehouses. Medieval London supported numerous small-scale industries that left distinctive archaeological signatures. Pottery kilns, metalworking furnaces, and textile processing facilities can be identified through specialized analysis of soil samples, structural remains, and waste products. These discoveries reveal the technological sophistication of medieval craftspeople and the complex supply chains that connected London to raw material sources across Britain and continental Europe. The leather industry, crucial to medieval London's economy, left particularly rich archaeological evidence. Tanning required large quantities of water, bark, and space for processing hides, creating distinctive archaeological signatures that can be identified centuries later. The discovery of medieval tanning pits, with their characteristic chemical residues and associated tools, provides information about both industrial processes and working conditions in one of the city's most important trades. Leather working tools, including specialized knives, awls, and finishing implements, reveal the skill levels required for different aspects of production. Brewing archaeology offers insights into one of medieval London's most ubiquitous industries. Every household brewed ale for daily consumption, while commercial brewers supplied taverns and inns throughout the city. Archaeological evidence includes brewing vessels, fermentation vats, and even the remains of malting floors where grain was processed for brewing. Chemical analysis of residues in these vessels can identify specific ingredients and brewing techniques, providing information about medieval taste preferences and food safety practices. The guild system that organized medieval London's crafts and trades left its own archaeological footprint. Guild halls, workshops, and even the residential quarters where apprentices lived can be identified through careful excavation and analysis. The discovery of guild symbols, ceremonial objects, and specialized tools provides evidence of how these organizations controlled quality, training, and market access within their respective trades. Some guild traditions persisted for centuries, creating archaeological continuities that span from medieval times to the Industrial Revolution. Women's work in medieval London, often invisible in historical records, becomes more apparent through archaeological investigation. Spindle whorls, loom weights, and other textile production tools appear frequently in domestic contexts, revealing the extent of household cloth production. Cooking vessels, food preparation tools, and evidence of small-scale commercial activities like brewing or baking show how women contributed to both household economies and urban commerce. The archaeological record preserves evidence of women's economic activities that rarely appear in official documents, but were crucial to the city's daily functioning. Childhood in medieval London can also be reconstructed through archaeological evidence. Toys, including miniature vessels, carved animals, and gaming pieces, appear in excavations across the city. Children's shoes, sized for growing feet, and often showing extensive wear and repair, provide evidence of family economics and parenting practices. Even evidence of accidents and injuries in juvenile skeletons reveals aspects of child-rearing practices in urban hazards that affected London's youngest residents. The integration of archaeological information with historical documents and architectural evidence continues to provide new interpretations of London's development. Rather than treating these sources of information separately, researchers increasingly recognize that each provides essential context for understanding the others. Archaeological finds can illuminate aspects of daily life that rarely appear in historical records, while documents can provide dates, names, and social context for archaeological discoveries. Fire history, recorded in both documents and archaeological deposits, reveals how frequently medieval London experienced destructive blazes. The Great Fire of 1666 was merely the largest in a series of conflagrations that periodically swept through the city's closely packed timber buildings. Archaeological evidence of earlier fires appears as layers of ash and burned debris interspersed with occupation deposits. These fire horizons help date archaeological sequences while providing information about building practices, firefighting efforts, and recovery processes that allowed the city to repeatedly rebuild itself. The study of ancient diseases through skeletal remains has revealed the health challenges that faced London's population across different periods. Tuberculosis, malnutrition, and occupational injuries appear frequently in medieval cemetery excavations. Dental evidence indicates dietary patterns, while bone chemistry can reveal information about childhood nutrition and adult stress. Epidemic diseases like plague and smallpox left distinctive signatures in both individual skeletons and burial patterns that help researchers understand how these crises affected different segments of society. Environmental archaeology provides information about the natural world that surrounded medieval London. Pollen samples from archaeological deposits reveal what plants grew in and around the city, while seed remains indicate which crops were cultivated and which wild plants were gathered for food or medicine. Insect remains preserved in waterlogged deposits provide information about sanitation, storage practices, and even climate conditions. This environmental evidence helps reconstruct the ecological context within which London's human inhabitants lived and worked. The archaeology of pilgrimage reveals London's importance as a religious destination and waypoint for travelers heading to continental shrines. Pilgrim badges, discovered throughout the city, indicate the routes and destinations that connected London to the broader European pilgrimage network. The discovery of pilgrim hostels, hospitals, and even the remains of temporary camps provides evidence of how the city accommodated religious travelers and profited from their passage. Transportation archaeology extends beyond the famous Roman roads to include evidence of medieval bridge construction, river crossings, and the development of wheeled transport within the city. The remains of medieval London Bridge, with its distinctive stone construction and commercial buildings, represent one of Europe's most ambitious medieval engineering projects. Archaeological investigation of the bridge's foundations reveals construction techniques, while associated deposits preserve evidence of the commercial activities that made the bridge a center of urban life. So as we leave behind these cool, shadowed corridors of earth and stone, let your thoughts drift upward again. Let's rise from the dark soil beneath London and emerge into the brightly lit halls of another part of medieval life. The transition from the buried foundations of power to its most visible expressions takes us from the silent testimony of ancient stones to the vibrant displays of wealth and status that defined medieval society. Where the walls beneath spoke through their endurance and the artifacts whispered through their preservation, we now enter a world that announced itself through spectacle and ceremony. Let's step now into the world of feasts and finery, where tables groan beneath the weight of roasted meats and gilded platters. A space where the nobility gather, far removed from the grime of the city streets, surrounded by music, laughter, and the distant aroma of heavily spiced food. The great halls where such gatherings occurred were themselves monuments to power, their soaring timber roofs and tapestried walls designed to overwhelm visitors with displays of wealth and sophistication. But beyond the visual splendor lay complex social rituals that reinforced hierarchy, demonstrated loyalty, and negotiated the delicate relationships that held medieval society together. Every detail, from the placement of chairs to the sequence of courses, carried meaning that extended far beyond simple hospitality. It's time for our next chapter, Feasting with Lords. What medieval banquets were really like. As we leave behind the cool, buried walls beneath the city, picture yourself entering the great hall of a medieval manor or castle. The air is warmer here, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and roasted meats. Candlelight flickers across stone walls, casting soft shadows along the high beams and the woven tapestries that hang like muted storytellers from centuries past. The journey from the crypts below to this living, breathing space above ground marks a dramatic shift in atmosphere. Where the underground chambers held the silence of eternity, this hall pulses with the rhythms of daily life. The stone floors here bear different marks than those below. Instead of carved effigies and memorial inscriptions, these surfaces show the wear patterns of countless feet, the scuff marks of heavy furniture being moved, and the darker stains where wine has been spilled during particularly spirited celebrations. At the center of this space stands a long, heavy wooden table, polished by years of use and countless elbows resting upon its surface. The wood itself tells a story of its own. Oak, most likely, harvested from forests that may have stood for centuries before being felled to serve this purpose. The grain runs deep and dark, interrupted by knots that speak of the tree's struggle against wind and weather. Small nicks and cuts pepper the surface, evidence of the many meals that have been carved and served here. Some gouges run deeper than others, perhaps from the enthusiastic carving of a particularly tough roast, or the aggressive slam of a drinking vessel during a heated political discussion. The table's construction reveals the medieval craftsman's approach to permanence. Thick mortise and tenon joints, secured with wooden pegs rather than nails, ensure that this piece of furniture will outlast many generations of diners. The legs, each as thick as a man's torso, are carved with simple but elegant details. Vine patterns wind around the wood, interspersed with the occasional heraldic symbol that identifies the family or lord who commissioned the piece. On feast days, this table becomes the heart of noble life. The transformation begins hours before the first guest arrives. Servants spread heavy linen cloths across the wooden surface, the fabric so finely woven that it seems to glow in the firelight. These cloths represent a significant investment. The flax from which they were made may have been grown on the Lord's own lands, but the weaving required skilled artisans whose time was precious. The whiteness of the cloth signals more than cleanliness. It demonstrates the household's ability to maintain such pristine linens despite the challenges of medieval washing techniques. It is here that lords and ladies gather, dressed in layers of finely woven wool, silk, or linen. The clothing worn to these feasts serves multiple purposes beyond mere protection from the elements. Each garment broadcasts the wearer's social position, wealth, and political connections. The lord himself might wear a surcoat of the finest wool, dyed in colors that required expensive materials and skilled craftsmen to achieve. The deep blues came from imported indigo or woad, while brilliant reds required cochineal insects or madder root. The most prized color of all was purple, achieved through a complex process involving thousands of murex shells, making it accessible only to the highest nobility. Rich colors like deep reds, forest greens, and soft golds fill the hall, though only the wealthiest can afford imported dyes that hold their color without fading. The ladies' gowns sweep the rushes on the floor, their long trains requiring careful navigation around the furniture and other guests. These trains serve no practical purpose, but their very impracticality signals status. Only someone with servants to manage such cumbersome clothing could afford to wear it. The sleeves, too, often extend far beyond the hands, sometimes reaching nearly to the floor. These exaggerated proportions require constant adjustment and care, another visible reminder of the wearer's position above manual labor. The jewelry adorning these noble guests tells its own story of medieval economics and craftsmanship. Brooches, often serving the practical purpose of holding cloaks or securing veils, might be fashioned from silver or gold and set with precious stones. Each gemstone represents not just wealth, but connections to distant lands. Rubies from the Orient, sapphires from distant mountains, and pearls from dangerous ocean diving expeditions all find their way onto these noble bodies. The metalwork itself showcases the skill of local craftsmen who learned their trade through years of apprenticeship, working with tools and techniques passed down through generations. The feast begins slowly. This deliberate pacing serves multiple social functions. It allows guests to admire each other's clothing and jewelry, to engage in the careful dance of medieval politics, and to demonstrate the host's ability to control the evening's rhythm. The gradual build-up also serves practical purposes, giving the kitchen staff time to coordinate the complex logistics of feeding a large group with limited technology. Servants move through the hall, pouring wine and ale into simple metal goblets. These servants represent a carefully orchestrated hierarchy of their own. The most trusted might be members of the lord's extended family or the children of other noble houses, sent to learn court manners and make political connections. Others might be skilled craftsmen in their own right, employed not just for their ability to serve food, but for their knowledge of wines, their skill in carving meat, or their talent for managing the complex timing required to serve multiple courses simultaneously. The goblets themselves, while described as simple, actually represent significant metalworking skill. Each vessel must be shaped by hand, requiring the smith to understand how to work with pewter, silver, or even gold, depending on the status of the drinker. The metal must be heated to precise temperatures, hammered into shape without cracking, and finished to a smooth surface that won't impart unwanted flavors to the drink. The absence of glass at most medieval tables isn't just a matter of expense, though Venetian glass was indeed costly, but also reflects the practical reality that glass vessels were too fragile for the boisterous atmosphere of a feast. The drink itself is rarely pure. This isn't simply a matter of preference, but reflects the medieval understanding of health and nutrition. Pure wine was considered too strong for regular consumption, and potentially harmful to the body's natural balance. The medieval medical theory of the four humors suggested that different foods and drinks affected the body's internal equilibrium. Wine, being considered hot and dry, needed to be tempered with cooler, moister elements to maintain health. Wines are often mixed with spices or water to soften their harshness. The spices chosen for this purpose serve multiple functions. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves not only improve flavor, but were believed to aid digestion and provide medicinal benefits. These same spices, when mixed with wine, created beverages that modern palates might find surprisingly complex and sophisticated. The mixtures weren't random, but followed recipes passed down through generations, refined through experience, and adapted to the specific wines available. The process of wine storage and preservation also influenced these mixing practices. Medieval wines, lacking the sulfites and controlled fermentation of modern production, could vary dramatically in quality from barrel to barrel. Some might be harsh and acidic, requiring dilution and spicing to make them palatable. Others might be developing off flavors that spices could mask. The wine steward's skill lay not just in knowing which wines to serve, but in understanding how to modify them to create the best possible drinking experience. Ale is brewed thick and hearty, meant to satisfy both thirst and hunger. The brewing process in medieval times created beverages that were more nutritious than their modern counterparts. The grains used in brewing retained more of their nutrients, and the fermentation process, while less controlled than modern methods, often resulted in ales that contained significant amounts of B vitamins and other beneficial compounds. The thickness came from the high proportion of grain to water, and the fact that the brewing process often left more solid matter in suspension. Different ales were brewed for different purposes and social levels. The strongest and most flavorful were reserved for special occasions and high-status guests. Weaker ales, sometimes called small beer, were consumed daily by everyone from children to adults as a safer alternative to water, which might carry disease. The brewing process, requiring boiling water and fermentation, killed many of the pathogens that made untreated water dangerous. The first course arrives: platters of bread, cheese, and preserved fruits. This opening course, while appearing simple, actually represents a complex display of the host's resources and planning abilities. The bread alone tells a story of agricultural management, seasonal planning, and skilled labor. The grain from which it was made had to be grown, harvested, stored, milled, and finally baked. Each step required expertise and presented opportunities for things to go wrong. The bread is dense and coarse, often used as a utensil as much as food. This density isn't a sign of poor quality, but rather reflects the milling technology available and the types of grain commonly used. Wheat, when available, produced the finest bread, but barley, rye, and oats were more commonly used, either alone or in combination. The coarseness came from stone mills that couldn't achieve the fine grinding possible with modern steel roller mills. The resulting bread had more texture and flavor than modern refined breads, and its density made it particularly suitable for its intended uses. Called trenchers, these slabs of bread serve as makeshift plates, absorbing the juices from meats and sauces. The trencher system represents an elegant solution to several medieval challenges. Metal plates were expensive and required significant resources to produce and maintain. Wooden plates, while cheaper, could absorb flavors and odors and required careful cleaning to prevent disease. Bread trenchers solved these problems while adding their own benefits to the meal. The bread used for trenchers was typically baked specifically for this purpose. It was made denser and less salted than regular eating bread, designed to absorb liquids without immediately falling apart. The size and thickness were standardized within each household, ensuring that the trenchers could adequately support the food placed upon them. Some households developed special recipes for trencher bread, incorporating herbs or other flavoring agents that would complement the foods to be served. By the meal's end, the soggy remains of the bread may be given to servants, beggars waiting outside, or sometimes left for the household dogs. This practice reflects the medieval approach to waste, which was far more comprehensive than modern recycling efforts. Nothing edible was discarded if it could be put to use. The bread trenchers, saturated with meat juices and sauces, became a valuable source of nutrition for those lower on the social hierarchy. The distribution of used trenchers followed strict social protocols. The best portions might go to favored servants or to the poor who gathered outside the hall during feast times. This wasn't simply charity, but part of a complex social contract that bound different levels of society together. The Lord's generosity with feast scraps helped maintain his reputation and ensured a supply of labor when needed. The recipients, in turn, were expected to show gratitude and loyalty. As the evening continues, larger dishes appear. The timing of each course reflects not just culinary considerations, but social and political ones as well. The interval between courses provides opportunities for conversation, for observing other guests, and for the subtle negotiations that keep medieval society functioning. Lords might use these moments to discuss marriages between their children, to negotiate trading agreements, or to share information about threats from neighboring territories. Roasted birds such as swans, peacocks, or geese arrived decorated with their own feathers for dramatic effect. These elaborate presentations represent the medieval love of spectacle and the integration of art with dining. The process of preparing such dishes required remarkable skill. The bird had to be carefully skinned to preserve the feathers, roasted to perfection, and then reassembled so convincingly that guests might initially believe they were seeing a living creature. The choice of birds for these presentations wasn't random. Swans, being royal birds in many territories, could only be served by those with the proper legal rights. Peacocks, exotic and beautiful, demonstrated the host's connections to distant lands and sophisticated suppliers. Each bird carried symbolic meanings that educated diners would understand and appreciate. The peacock, for instance, was associated with pride and resurrection, making it particularly appropriate for certain religious feast days. The presentation is as important as the taste. Medieval dining was theater, and each dish was designed to provoke amazement, discussion, and appreciation for the host's sophistication. Cooks and servants responsible for these presentations were artists in their own right, combining culinary skills with knowledge of heraldry, symbolism, and visual impact. The most skilled could create dishes that told stories, with different elements representing characters or events from literature, history, or religion. Some presentations went far beyond simple decoration. Elaborate dishes might be constructed as castles, with walls made of pastry and towers topped with banners bearing the host's coat of arms. Others might recreate famous battle scenes, with armies of pastry figures arranged around a centerpiece representing a famous victory. These creations required not just culinary skill, but also knowledge of architecture, sculpture, and painting. Chefs used sauces thickened with ground almonds or breadcrumbs, flavored with saffron, cinnamon, or vinegar. The sauces served at medieval feasts were far more complex and varied than modern diners might expect. The thickening agents reveal the ingenuity required to create satisfying textures without modern ingredients like refined flour or cornstarch. Ground almonds produced rich, creamy sauces that complemented meat dishes while adding their own subtle flavors. The almonds had to be blanched, peeled, and ground by hand, a time-consuming process that added to the cost and prestige of any dish that incorporated them. Breadcrumbs served a different function, creating sauces with more body and ability to carry other flavors. The bread used for this purpose was often specially prepared, sometimes toasted or seasoned before grinding. Different types of bread produced different flavors and textures in the final sauce. White bread created neutral-tasting thickeners, while darker breads added their own flavors to the mix. The spices are not only for flavor, but also for display. Imported spices like pepper and cloves signal the host's wealth and global connections. The spice trade in medieval times was one of the most profitable and dangerous forms of commerce. Spices had to travel thousands of miles over land and sea routes, controlled by various kingdoms, emirates, and trading companies. Each transfer point added costs and risks, making the final prices astronomical by the time they reached European markets. Saffron, derived from crocus flowers, required incredible amounts of labor to produce. Each flower yielded only a tiny amount of the precious spice, and the harvesting had to be done by hand during a very short season. The resulting product was literally worth more than its weight in gold, making dishes flavored with saffron clear demonstrations of the host's financial resources. Pepper, sometimes called black gold, was so valuable that it was used as currency in some transactions. The long journey from the pepper-growing regions of India and Southeast Asia to European tables involved multiple middlemen, each taking their profit. By the time peppercorns reached a medieval kitchen, they represented an investment comparable to precious gems. The knowledge required to use these spices properly was itself valuable. Cooks had to understand not just which spices complemented which foods, but also how much to use, when to add them in the cooking process, and how to balance them with other ingredients. Too much of a precious spice was wasteful. Too little failed to achieve the desired effect. The best cooks developed reputations that could advance their careers and increase their value to noble households. Between courses, musicians play soft tunes on lutes, harps, or flutes. The music serves multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. The careful selection of songs and melodies helps set the mood for different parts of the meal, provides a sophisticated backdrop for conversation, and demonstrates the host's cultural refinement. The musicians themselves represent another aspect of medieval court life, skilled artisans whose talents were valued, but whose social status remained ambiguous. The instruments played at these feasts required considerable skill to master. The lute, with its multiple strings and complex fingering patterns, demanded years of practice to play competently. Harps required not just technical skill, but also the physical strength to maintain proper posture and hand position over long performance periods. Flutes and other wind instruments needed breath control and embouchure techniques that took time to develop. The choice of music reflected both the occasion and the audience. Religious feast days called for sacred music that reinforced the spiritual significance of the celebration. Secular feasts might feature love songs, martial ballads, or humorous pieces designed to entertain and amuse the guests. The most skilled musicians could adapt their selections to the mood of the evening, responding to the conversations and interactions they observed among the diners. Minstrels recite poetry or perform songs celebrating heroic deeds or courtly love. These performances serve important social and political functions. Stories of heroic deeds reinforce the values and ideals that justify the nobility's privileged position in society. Tales of courtly love provide models for behavior and relationship expectations among the upper classes. Both types of entertainment help maintain the cultural frameworks that keep medieval society stable. The minstrels themselves occupy a unique position in medieval society. They travel between courts, carrying news, gossip, and cultural trends from one place to another. Their performances often incorporate subtle political messages, praise for the host, or commentary on current events. The most successful minstrels develop reputations that allow them to command higher fees and gain access to the most prestigious courts. The repertoire of a skilled minstrel might include hundreds of songs, stories, and poems. Some pieces were traditional, passed down through generations of performers. Others were newly composed, perhaps by the minstrel himself or commissioned for specific occasions. The best minstrels could improvise, creating new verses to existing songs or adapting traditional stories to current circumstances. Guests murmur among themselves, voices blending with the gentle clatter of utensils and the occasional burst of laughter. The soundscape of a medieval feast creates its own atmosphere, different from the controlled quiet of modern fine dining. The combination of conversation, music, and the sounds of eating and drinking produces a lively, sometimes boisterous environment that encourages social interaction and celebration. The conversations taking place during these feasts serve crucial functions in medieval society. Political alliances are formed, business deals are negotiated, and social relationships are maintained and developed. The informal setting allows for discussions that might be difficult in more formal circumstances. The presence of food and drink helps lubricate social interactions and create an atmosphere of shared pleasure and abundance. The laughter that punctuates the evening might arise from various sources. Humorous stories told by minstrels, amusing incidents during the meal, or witty comments from guests all contribute to the festive atmosphere. The ability to appreciate and contribute to the humor of the evening is itself a social skill, one that can advance careers and improve relationships. Table manners are guided more by status than etiquette. While modern dining etiquette focuses on universal rules of politeness and consideration, medieval table behavior reinforced social hierarchies and political relationships. The ways in which food was served, consumed, and discussed all reflected and reinforced the social order. Higher-ranking guests sit closest to the Lord, receiving the choicest cuts of meat and the finest wine. This arrangement isn't simply a matter of courtesy, but a visible representation of the social and political relationships within the community. The seating plan itself becomes a form of communication, showing all present where each individual stands in the hierarchy of power and influence. The choicest cuts of meat weren't just about flavor, but about symbolism and nutrition. Certain parts of animals were considered more prestigious than others, and the distribution of these pieces communicated the host's assessment of each guest's importance. The finest wine, similarly, was reserved for those whose favor was most important to maintain, or whose displeasure was most dangerous to risk. Lower-ranking guests sit farther down the table, where dishes arrive cooler and portions smaller. This wasn't necessarily intentional slight, but reflected the practical realities of serving food in an era without warming equipment. However, the systematic nature of this disparity reinforced social boundaries and reminded everyone of their place in the hierarchy. The experience of dining farther from the head table was different in many ways. Conversation was more difficult to hear. The view of entertainers was less clear, and the quality of service was generally lower. These differences were accepted as natural and appropriate, part of the social order that provided structure and stability to medieval life. Dessert, when it arrives, is modest by modern standards. The concept of dessert as a separate, sweet course at the end of the meal was still developing during the medieval period. What we might recognize as dessert foods were often integrated throughout the meal or served as special treats rather than standard course endings. Candied fruits, small pastries, or spiced nuts fill wooden bowls. These items represent sophisticated food preservation and preparation techniques. Candying fruit required knowledge of sugar work, a skill that was both technically demanding and expensive to practice. The sugar itself was an imported luxury, arriving from distant plantations at great cost. The process of candying preserved fruits for long periods, allowing households to enjoy sweet treats even when fresh fruit was unavailable. Small pastries demonstrated the baker's artistry and the household's access to fine ingredients. These might be filled with nuts, dried fruits, or sweet cheeses, and shaped into decorative forms. The pastry itself required skilled handling to achieve the proper texture and appearance. Different types of pastry were appropriate for different fillings and occasions, and the best bakers maintained closely guarded recipes that gave them competitive advantages. Spiced nuts combined preservation with flavor enhancement. The spicing process not only made the nuts more interesting to eat, but also helped preserve them and potentially provided medicinal benefits. Different combinations of spices produced different flavors and effects, and households might develop signature spice blends that became part of their reputation. On special occasions, a decorative marchpane, made from almond paste and sugar, might be sculpted into the shape of castles, animals, or flowers. Marchpane represents the pinnacle of medieval confectionery art. The combination of ground almonds and sugar created a moldable medium that skilled artisans could shape into elaborate decorative pieces. These weren't just food, but edible sculptures that demonstrated both artistic skill and expensive ingredients. The subjects chosen from marchpane sculptures often had symbolic significance. Castles might represent the host's own strongholds, or famous fortifications from history or literature. Animals could symbolize heraldic beasts associated with noble families or creatures from popular stories. Flowers might represent seasons, virtues, or romantic themes appropriate to the occasion. Creating these sculptures required specialized tools and techniques. The marchpane had to be prepared to exactly the right consistency, neither too soft to hold its shape nor too hard to work with. The sculptor needed not just artistic skill, but also understanding of the material's properties and limitations. Colors could be added using various natural dyes and pigments, creating finished pieces that were both beautiful and edible. As the evening draws to a close, the air grows cooler again. The natural rhythm of the feast reflects both practical considerations and social traditions. As the fires burn lower and candles shorten, the cost of maintaining full illumination increases. The gradual dimming of the light creates a natural signal that the evening is ending, allowing guests to prepare for departure without abrupt transitions. The cooling air also reflects the medieval understanding of health and comfort. Extended periods of eating and drinking in warm, crowded spaces were thought to be potentially harmful to the body's natural balance. The gradual cooling provided a transition back to normal conditions and helped prepare the body for sleep. The fires burn lower, and guests begin to drift away. The departure process follows its own protocols and timings. The most important guests might be the first to leave, their departure signaling to others that the evening is ending. Alternatively, they might stay latest, continuing important conversations begun during the meal. The host must balance his desire to extend hospitality with practical considerations of household management and guest comfort. Some guests might remain overnight, particularly if they have traveled significant distances or if weather conditions make travel dangerous. Medieval hospitality often included providing accommodations for guests, though the quality of these accommodations varied significantly based on the guest's status and the host's resources. Servants clear the tables, sweep the rushes from the floor, and prepare the hall for the quiet of night. The cleanup process reveals another aspect of medieval household management. Every item used during the feast must be properly cleaned, stored, or disposed of. The valuable items, such as silver goblets or expensive serving pieces, require careful handling and secure storage. The rushes on the floor, mixed with herbs and flowers at the beginning of the evening, now contain food scraps, spilled drinks, and other debris from the feast. These must be swept up and replaced with fresh materials for the next day. The used rushes aren't wasted, but might be composted or used as animal bedding, continuing the medieval practice of reusing everything possible. The preparation for night involves more than just cleaning. Fires must be banked to provide warmth through the night without risk of spreading. Candles and torches must be extinguished safely. Valuable items must be secured against theft. The hall must be arranged to accommodate any guests staying overnight. For the nobility, sleep will come on feather-stuffed mattresses, with woolen blankets pulled high against the chill. The quality of sleeping accommodations reflects the same social hierarchies that governed the feast itself. The finest mattresses, filled with down from geese or swans, provided comfort that was unimaginable to most of the population. The woolen blankets, woven from the finest fleeces and possibly imported from regions known for their textile production, represented significant investments in comfort and status. The sleeping chambers of the nobility were designed to provide privacy, warmth, and security. Heavy curtains around beds created private spaces within larger rooms, providing both warmth and intimacy. The bed itself was often an expensive piece of furniture, with elaborate woodwork, rich fabrics, and sometimes religious or heraldic decorations. The nighttime routine of the nobility included assistance from personal servants who helped with undressing, provided washing water, and ensured that sleeping arrangements were comfortable and secure. Chamber pots were positioned conveniently, and night lights might be provided for safety and convenience. For those who worked behind the scenes, sleep may wait a little longer. The servants, cooks, and other household staff face hours of additional work before they can rest. This reality reflects the social structure that made such elaborate feasts possible. The pleasure and comfort of the nobility depended on the labor and sacrifice of many others. There are dishes to wash, leftovers to sort, and floors to scrub. Each of these tasks requires specific skills and knowledge. Washing dishes without modern detergents and hot running water required understanding of which cleaning agents were available and effective. Sand, ashes, and soap made from animal fats and plant materials provided the primary cleaning power. Sorting leftovers involved decisions about what could be saved, what should be redistributed, and what had to be discarded. The economics of medieval households demanded that nothing edible be wasted if it could be put to use. Leftovers might be incorporated into meals for the servants, given to the poor, or preserved for future use. Scrubbing floors was physically demanding work that had to be done thoroughly to maintain sanitation and prevent pest problems. The rushes and herbs used to cover floors helped control odors and provided some comfort underfoot, but they also required regular replacement and cleaning. Yet soon enough, even the bustling kitchens will fall silent. The kitchen staff, despite their long hours and hard work, were essential to the smooth functioning of noble households. Their skills in food preparation, preservation, and service made possible the elaborate social rituals that maintained medieval society. The silence that eventually settles over the kitchen represents the end of a complex orchestration of human effort. The successful completion of a feast required coordination between numerous individuals, each with specific responsibilities and skills. The final quiet marks not just the end of one evening, but the completion of days or weeks of preparation. The kitchen itself, now empty of the bustle of food preparation and service, reveals its true character. The massive fireplaces, still warm from the evening's cooking, represent significant investments in infrastructure. The stone ovens, copper pots, and iron utensils reflect generations of accumulated equipment and expertise. And with that final image of flickering candlelight and cooling hearths, let's slowly draw our journey to a close. From the crowded streets below, to the quiet tombs beneath, and finally, to the echoing halls above. The progression from street to crypt to hall represents the full spectrum of medieval life, from the bustling activity of commerce and daily life through the eternal silence of death to the ritualized splendor of noble society. Let's settle now into the final moments of tonight's story. But as we prepare to leave this world of candlelit feasts and elaborate ceremonies, one question lingers in the cooling air of the great hall. What happened when the sun rose again? When the servants had completed their tasks and the guests had departed, when the lord and lady emerged from their feathered beds to face another day, what filled the hours between such grand occasions? The morning light that would soon stream through the tall windows of the hall would illuminate not just the remnants of the previous evening's celebration, but the beginning of another cycle in the endless rhythm of medieval life. In that space between celebration and routine, between public ceremony and private necessity, lies perhaps the most intriguing story of all. The very architecture of these great halls was designed to accommodate such gatherings, with their soaring ceilings and massive stone columns that could support the weight of centuries. These spaces had witnessed countless feasts, each one adding its own layer of history to the stones. The builders who constructed these halls understood that they were creating more than mere dining rooms. They were crafting theaters for the performance of power, stages where the drama of medieval politics and society would unfold night after night. The acoustics of these halls were carefully considered, though perhaps not with the scientific precision of modern concert halls. The height of the ceilings and the placement of tapestries helped control sound, ensuring that conversations could take place at reasonable volumes, while still allowing the Lord's voice to carry when necessary. The resonance created by the stone walls gave weight to spoken words, making proclamations and announcements feel more significant and authoritative. Ventilation was another crucial consideration in these enclosed spaces filled with people, candles, and cooking fires. High windows near the ceiling allowed smoke and heated air to escape while drawing in fresh air from below. The arrangement of doors and passages created subtle air currents that helped maintain reasonable comfort levels, even when the hall was packed with guests. Without these considerations, the combination of body heat, open flames, and cooking odors could quickly make such spaces unbearable. The tapestries that adorned these walls served purposes far beyond decoration. These massive woven artworks provided insulation against the cold stone walls, helping to retain heat within the space. The thick fabric also absorbed sound, preventing the harsh echoes that bare stone walls would create. Most importantly, they told stories. Each tapestry was a narrative in thread, depicting scenes from history, literature, or religion that educated viewers and reinforced cultural values. The creation of such tapestries represented enormous investments of time, skill, and resources. Master weavers worked for months or even years to complete a single large piece. The threads themselves were expensive, with silk threads imported from distant lands and dyes created from rare materials. The designs required artistic vision and technical expertise to translate complex scenes into the medium of woven fabric. Some tapestries depicted the exploits of the family who owned the hall, showing ancestors in battle or celebrating important alliances. Others illustrated scenes from popular literature, bringing to life the stories that minstrels sang about during feasts. Religious tapestries reminded viewers of moral lessons and spiritual truths, often depicting biblical scenes or the lives of saints in rich detail. The positioning of tapestries within the hall followed careful consideration of viewing angles, lighting, and symbolic meaning. The most important pieces were placed where they could be seen by the greatest number of guests, while others might be positioned to be viewed by specific groups or individuals. The interplay between the tapestries and the activities of the feast created a complex visual environment that enhanced the overall experience. Beyond the main hall, a network of smaller chambers and service areas supported the grand entertainments. Pantries stored the vast quantities of food required for major feasts, with different rooms dedicated to different types of provisions. Dry storage areas kept grains, spices, and preserved foods safe from moisture and pests. Cool cellars provided ideal conditions for storing wines, ales, and perishable items that needed to be kept at lower temperatures. The wine cellars themselves were marvels of medieval engineering. Carved into bedrock or built with thick stone walls, these spaces maintained consistent temperatures year-round. The arrangement of storage areas allowed for proper aging of wines and systematic rotation of stock. Knowledge of which wines were ready to drink and which needed more time was crucial for successful feast planning. Spice storage required its own specialized knowledge and facilities. Different spices had different storage requirements, and the enormous value of these substances meant that security was paramount. Some spices needed to be kept completely dry, while others required specific temperature ranges. The spice master's knowledge of proper storage techniques could mean the difference between preserved value and expensive losses. The brew house, often located near, but separate from the main kitchen, was another crucial facility. The brewing process required specialized equipment and knowledge, and the timing of brewing had to be coordinated with feast schedules to ensure adequate supplies of fresh ale. Different types of ales were brewed for different occasions and social levels, requiring careful planning and resource allocation. Water sources for the entire complex required careful management. Wells, springs, or streams had to provide adequate quantities of clean water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and brewing. The quality of water sources was crucial not just for taste, but for health and safety. Contaminated water could sicken or kill guests, destroying reputations and political relationships. The coordination required to bring all these elements together for a successful feast was staggering. The steward responsible for overall management had to balance competing demands for resources, coordinate timing across multiple departments, and ensure that social protocols were properly observed. This individual needed to understand not just practical logistics, but also the political implications of every decision. Menu planning itself was a complex art that required knowledge of seasonal availability, guest preferences, symbolic meanings of different foods, and the practical limitations of kitchen equipment. The selection of dishes had to demonstrate the host's wealth and sophistication, while remaining within the bounds of what could actually be prepared and served successfully. The timing of food preparation had to account for the different cooking times required for various dishes, the serving order that would best showcase each course, and the social rhythms of the evening. Some dishes needed to be started days in advance, while others required last-minute preparation to ensure optimal flavor and presentation. Procurement of ingredients often began weeks or months before major feasts. Rare spices had to be ordered from traveling merchants, Special wines had to be selected and purchased, and exotic ingredients had to be sourced from distant suppliers. The network of relationships required to obtain the finest ingredients was itself a form of social and economic capital. The training of servants for these elaborate occasions was an ongoing process. New staff had to learn not just the practical skills of food service, but also the complex social protocols that governed interactions with guests of different ranks. The ability to read social situations and respond appropriately was as important as technical competence in carrying plates or pouring wine. The kitchen hierarchy during major feasts was military in its precision and discipline. The head cook commanded absolute authority, with specialized assistants responsible for different aspects of meal preparation. Spit boys turned roasts over fires, sauce makers prepared the complex accompaniments, and carvers practiced their skills to ensure that meat was presented properly. Fire management was perhaps the most critical and dangerous aspect of feast preparation. Multiple fires had to be maintained at different temperatures for different cooking methods. The risk of kitchen fires was constant, and the consequences of poor fire management could be catastrophic. Master cooks developed almost supernatural skills in reading fires and adjusting them for optimal cooking results. The serving of food during the feast followed choreographed patterns that had been rehearsed in advance. Servers had to know not just which dishes to bring to which guests, but also the proper approaches, the correct serving implements, and the appropriate responses to various situations that might arise. A dropped platter or spilled wine could ruin carefully planned presentations and embarrass the host. The coordination between kitchen and hall required constant communication. Signals had to be passed to indicate when courses were ready, when guests were ready for the next service, and when problems arose that required adjustment. The timing of this communication was crucial to maintaining the smooth flow of the evening. Entertainment during feasts was carefully orchestrated to complement the dining experience. Musicians had to understand when to play louder or softer, when to switch between different types of music, and how to respond to the changing moods of the evening. Minstrels telling stories had to gauge their audiences and adjust their material accordingly. The social dynamics during feasts were complex and ever-changing. Conversations moved between topics, alliances formed and dissolved, and the careful observer could witness the full spectrum of medieval political and social interaction. The host had to monitor these dynamics constantly, intervening when necessary to prevent conflicts or encourage beneficial connections. Marriage negotiations often took place during these gatherings, with potential matches being evaluated, not just on the basis of dowries and landholdings, but also on personal compatibility and family connections. The informal atmosphere of a feast provided opportunities for young people to meet and interact under the watchful eyes of their families. Trade agreements and business partnerships were another common topic of feast conversation. The relaxed atmosphere and generous hospitality created conditions favorable to negotiation, while the presence of multiple parties allowed for complex multilateral discussions. Some of the most important economic relationships in medieval society were forged over dining tables. Military alliances and political agreements were also frequently discussed during feasts. The combination of food, drink, and entertainment created an atmosphere of trust and fellowship that encouraged open discussion of sensitive topics. The informal nature of these conversations allowed for exploration of possibilities that might be difficult to raise in more formal settings. The end of a feast marked not just the conclusion of an evening's entertainment, but often the beginning of new relationships and agreements. Guests departed with new connections, new information, and new obligations. The success or failure of a feast could have implications that extended far beyond the immediate event. The reputation of a host was built on consistent success in providing memorable and appropriate entertainments. Word of particularly successful feasts spread through the networks of medieval communication, enhancing the host's status and influence. Conversely, failures could damage reputations and reduce political effectiveness. The costs of such elaborate entertainments were enormous, representing significant portions of annual household budgets. The decision to host a major feast was often a calculated investment in social and political capital, with expected returns in the form of enhanced relationships and increased influence. The memories of particularly successful feasts could last for generations, becoming part of family and regional traditions. Stories of legendary feasts were passed down through oral tradition, often growing more elaborate with each telling. These stories became part of the cultural heritage that defined noble families and their places in society. As dawn approached and the last of the cleanup was completed, the great hall stood ready for whatever the new day might bring. A cycle of preparation, celebration, and recovery that defined noble life would soon begin again. But the memories of this particular evening would linger in the minds of all who participated. The seasonal nature of these grand feasts meant that each one reflected the agricultural calendar that governed medieval life. Spring celebrations might feature the first fresh herbs and young vegetables, symbols of renewal and hope after the long winter months. Summer feasts could showcase the abundance of fresh fruits and the finest cuts of meat from animals that had grazed on rich pastures. Autumn gatherings celebrated the harvest with displays of grain, preserved fruits, and the products of successful agricultural management. Winter feasts, perhaps the most elaborate of all, demonstrated the household's ability to maintain luxury and abundance even when the natural world lay dormant. The preserved meats, aged cheeses, and carefully stored wines that appeared on winter tables represented months of careful planning and resource management. These celebrations provided warmth and light during the darkest months, reinforcing social bonds when communities were most isolated from the outside world. The influence of these feasting traditions extended far beyond the walls of individual castles and manor houses, shaping the broader culture of medieval Europe and creating patterns of hospitality and social interaction that would endure for centuries to come. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the overflowing streets of medieval cities to the fear that swept through during the Black Death. From the buried stone walls hidden beneath London's busy avenues to the echoing banquets in noble halls. A long, slow walk through the crowded, layered, and often forgotten corners of medieval urban life. If you're still awake, thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the clatter of market stalls and the soft music of the Lord's Hall, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole point. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly dive into history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always nice seeing where in the world these late-night history journeys are reaching. For now, I'll let the noise of the marketplace fade, the echo of distant church bells grow softer, and the last glow of candlelight dim gently, one by one. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.